Welcome back to MrNightfall, and hello to anyone joining for the first time. This video features ghost stories and haunted encounters, carefully told to help you relax and drift into sleep. If you enjoy tonight's stories, like, subscribe, and comment your location below. Get cozy, clear your mind, and let's begin. Story 1. I found a VHS tape labeled "Last Night in This House" and pressed play at midnight. The box was tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the master bedroom closet, a detail I only discovered because my cat, Miso, had been obsessively pawing at that particular spot for 3 days straight. I'd assumed she was chasing a mouse or reacting to some imperceptible draft. But when I finally pried up the warped oak plank with a butter knife, I found not a rodent nest, but a shallow cavity containing a single object, a VHS tape in a white plastic case, its label handwritten in faded blue ink. "Last night in this house. Do not watch before midnight." I almost threw it away immediately. Who watches VHS tapes anymore? My apartment had no working VCR. I donated mine years ago when I finally embraced streaming services. But something about the specificity of the warning intrigued me. Do not watch before midnight. Not do not watch. Period. A conditional prohibition. An invitation disguised as a threat. I slipped the tape into my bag and spent the afternoon hunting through thrift stores until I found a dusty Panasonic player for $12. Its power cord frayed but intact, its tracking knob stiff with disuse. The apartment itself was a temporary solution. A one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a converted Victorian that had seen better days. I'd taken it on short notice after my landlord sold my previous building, and the rent was suspiciously low for the neighborhood. The realtor had been evasive about why the previous tenant left so abruptly. "Personal reasons," she'd said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "But the place is spotless. You'll love it." She hadn't mentioned the faint smell of mildew that clung to the corners of the bedroom, or the way the floorboards groaned in a specific three-note pattern whenever I walked from the kitchen to the living room, or the fact that the previous tenant had left behind a single item, a child's red hair ribbon tied neatly around the doorknob of the linen closet. I set up the VCR beneath my small television just after dinner, my movements casual, but my heart beating a little too fast. The tape felt heavier than it should have, dense, as if the plastic shell contained something more substantial than magnetic tape. I ran my thumb over the label again. "Last night in this house." Whose house? This one. And whose last night? I checked the date on my phone. October 28th. Not a particularly ominous date, but close enough to Halloween that my rational mind could dismiss any unease as seasonal suggestibility. I decided to wait. Not out of fear, I told myself, but out of respect for the narrative. Midnight had been specified. Midnight it would be. The hours crawled by. I tried to distract myself with a book, but the words blurred on the page. I made tea, washed dishes, scrolled through my phone without absorbing anything. At 11:45 p.m., I carried the tape to the living room and inserted it into the VCR. The high machine whirred to life with a sound I hadn't heard in a decade, the mechanical whine of spinning reels, the soft clunk of the tape being pulled into place. I pressed play, but immediately hit pause, the television screen filling with blue static. 11 minutes to go. At 11:59 p.m., I unpaused the tape. The screen flickered to life, not with the expected tracking lines or color bars, but with a perfectly stable image. A bedroom. My bedroom. The same water stain on the ceiling in the shape of a bird in flight. The same scuff mark on the baseboard near the closet door where I'd accidentally kicked it while moving furniture. The same window overlooking the fire escape where a lone oak tree stood silhouetted against a moonless sky. But the room was different, emptier. No rug on the floor, no posters on the walls, no cat bed in the corner. And in the center of the frame, sitting on the edge of a bare mattress, was a man. He looked to be in his late 20s, with dark hair falling across, his forehead and a face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He wore a gray sweatshirt and jeans, his hands resting on his knees, his shoulders slumped forward as if carrying an invisible weight. For a full minute, he simply sat there, staring at the camera mounted on the dresser opposite the bed. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear despite the analog hiss underlying the recording. "If you're watching this, you've moved into this apartment. You found the tape. And it's past midnight." He offered a thin, humorless smile. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I lived here for 11 months. This is my last night." He shifted slightly, his eyes never leaving the lens. "I need to tell you what happens here. Not to scare you, though God knows you'll be scared, but so you understand, so you don't make the same mistakes I did." He took a deep breath. "This building was constructed in 1897 as a boarding house for unmarried women working in the textile mills. In 1903, a fire broke out in the basement laundry room. 23 women died, most of them trapped on the 3rd floor, the very floor this apartment occupies. Their bodies were recovered, but something remained. Not ghosts in the traditional sense, not floating sheets or rattling chains, something hungrier. Daniel leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The fire didn't just kill them. It trapped them in the moment of their greatest terror, the smoke filling their lungs, the heat blistering their skin, the certainty that no one was coming to save them. And that terror, it learned how to feed. It discovered that fear has a taste, that panic has a texture, and the freshest, most potent fear comes from those who don't yet know they're about to die. He glanced toward the window, his expression tightening. It waits until midnight. Always midnight. That's when the veil is thinnest, the anniversary of the fire, you see. October 29th, 1903, 1:17 a.m. to be precise. But it starts its work at midnight. It shows you things, makes you see what it wants you to see. And if you react, if you scream, if you run, if you let the fear take hold, it gains strength. It gets closer. On screen, Daniel stood up slowly and walked to the window. He didn't look out. Instead, he pressed his palm flat against the glass. "The first night I saw it, I thought I was dreaming. A woman is standing on the fire escape, her dress smoldering at the edges, her face a mask of soot and agony. She was mouthing words I couldn't hear. I woke up screaming, called the police. They found nothing, told me I'd had a nightmare." He turned back to the camera, his eyes glistening. The second night, she was inside the room, standing at the foot of the bed. Her skin was peeling away in blackened strips. She reached for me. I ran. Slept in my car for 3 nights after that. Daniel walked back to the bed and sat down again, his movements heavy with resignation. But you can't run forever. The fear follows you. It grows stronger each time you feed it. And eventually you realize the only way to survive is not to be afraid, to watch without reacting, to witness without participating. He looked directly into the lens, his gaze piercing through time and technology to meet mine. Tonight, I'm going to let it come. I'm not going to run. I'm not going to scream. I'm going to sit right here and watch what happens. And I'm recording it so you'll know. So when your time comes, and it will come because it always comes for the new tenant, you'll understand what you're facing. Daniel glanced at a digital clock on the nightstand. 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes, he whispered. Then, to my horror, he reached forward and adjusted the camera, widening the frame to include not just the bed, but the entire room, the door, the window, the closet. He settled back onto the mattress, his posture unnaturally rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His breathing was shallow, controlled. He was preparing himself, bracing. The clock on the nightstand ticked over to 11:59 p.m. And then, at exactly midnight, the temperature in my apartment dropped. I felt it before I saw it, a sudden, profound cold that had no business existing in a centrally heated building in late October. My breath fogged in front of the television screen. Goosebumps erupted across my arms, and on the tape, Daniel flinched, just slightly, a tightening around his eyes. He hadn't expected the cold to be so immediate. At 12:01 a.m., the first figure appeared, not on the fire escape, not at the foot of the bed, but reflected in the dark window behind Daniel, a woman in a high-collared dress, her hair arranged in an elaborate updo streaked with ash. Her face was turned toward the glass, her mouth open in a silent scream, her hands pressed against the pane from the outside. But there was no one on my fire escape. I'd checked before pressing play. The window behind me was empty, except for the reflection of my own terrified face. On screen, Daniel didn't turn. He kept his eyes fixed on the camera, his breathing steady despite the tremor in his lower lip. The woman in the window began to change, the fabric of her dress blackening, curling at the edges like burning paper. Smoke, faint but unmistakable, began to curl from her shoulders. Still, Daniel didn't move. At 12:07 a.m., the bedroom door creaked open, not on the tape, in my apartment. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The sound was unmistakable. The slow, deliberate groan of hinges I'd oiled just that afternoon. I hadn't locked the deadbolt. Stupid, careless. But I lived on the 3rd floor. No one could have entered without passing through the locked front door of the building. On screen, Daniel's door remained closed, but his eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He could hear it too. Not in his room, in mine. The tape was bridging the decades, connecting his midnight to mine, his terror to mine. At 12:12 a.m., the second figure appeared on the tape. This one standing in the corner of Daniel's room, partially obscured by shadow. A younger woman, her arms wrapped around herself as if warding off cold, her nightgown stained with dark patches that might have been water or blood. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face. She wasn't looking at Daniel, she was looking at me, at the camera lens, at my eyes watching from 70 years in the future. And she was crying. Silent, desperate tears that carved clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. In my apartment, The smell hit me next. Smoke. Not the clean scent of a fireplace or candle, but the acrid stench of burning wool and hair, the chemical tang of old-fashioned fabric-catching flame. It grew stronger by the second, thick enough to coat the back of my throat, to make my eyes water. I wanted to run, to tear the tape from the VCR and flee into the hallway. But Daniel's warning echoed in my mind. If you react, if you scream, if you run, if you let the fear take hold, it gains strength. I stayed. I forced myself to breathe through my mouth, to keep my eyes on the screen, to witness without participating. At 12:15 a.m., Daniel began to change, not his expression, his body. The skin on his hands darkened, blistering as if exposed to intense heat. He didn't cry out, didn't flinch, but a low moan escaped his lips, a sound of pure agony he couldn't quite suppress. The blisters spread up his arms, his neck, his face. His sweatshirt began to smolder at the edges, tiny embers glowing in the fabric. He was burning alive on camera, and he was refusing to look away from the lens, refusing to give them the satisfaction of his fear. At 12:16 a.m., the third figure appeared on the tape. This one standing directly behind Daniel's chair, her hands resting on his shoulders. An older woman with silver-streaked hair and a face lined with kindness, even in death. She leaned close to Daniel's ear and whispered something. I couldn't hear the words through the tape's hiss, but I saw Daniel's response. His shoulders relaxing slightly, the tension in his jaw easing. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and then he looked directly into the camera and mouthed 3 words, "Don't be afraid." At 12:17 a.m., the exact moment the fire had reached the 3rd floor in 1903, Daniel Mercer burst into flame, not gradually, not with smoke preceding fire. One moment, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, blistered but intact. The next, his entire body was engulfed in silent white-hot fire that consumed him in seconds. There was no screaming, no thrashing, just a man sitting calmly as his body turned to ash, his eyes remaining open and fixed on the camera until the very end. When the flames subsided, only a pile of gray ash remained on the mattress, and standing around that ash were 23 women, their forms no longer charred and agonized, but whole, peaceful, their faces clean, their dresses pristine, their hands clasped together as if in prayer. They looked at the camera one last time, not with malice, not with hunger, but with gratitude. Then they faded, leaving only the empty room and the pile of ash on the bed. The tape continued for 3 more minutes, static, then the sound of a key turning in a lock, then nothing. At 12:20 a.m., the screen went black. In my apartment, the cold receded as suddenly as it had come. The smell of smoke vanished, the door stood closed, the room was silent except for my ragged breathing and the soft whir of the VCR eating up the tail end of the tape. I didn't move for a full hour. I sat on my couch, wrapped in a blanket I didn't remember fetching, staring at the black television screen. My mind raced through rational explanations. Carbon monoxide poisoning, sleep paralysis, mass hysteria triggered by suggestion. But the cold had been real. The smell had been real. The door had creaked open. I'd heard it with my own ears. At 1:30 a.m., I forced myself to stand. I ejected the tape with trembling hands and carried it to the kitchen sink. I was about to snap it in half when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. scratched into the plastic shell along the edge, nearly invisible unless caught by the light. A series of numbers. October 29th, 1903. And beneath them, a single word. Witness. I didn't destroy the tape. I couldn't. Instead, I placed it back in its case and hid it beneath the same loose floorboard where I'd found it. Then I went to bed, leaving every light in the apartment burning. I didn't sleep. I lay rigid beneath the covers, listening to the house settle around me, jumping at every creak and sigh. At 2:47 a.m., I heard it, a soft tapping at the window, not insistent, not threatening, just 3 gentle raps against the glass. I didn't move, didn't look. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, my breathing slow and even, and after a full minute, the tapping stopped. The next morning, I called my landlord. I need to break my lease, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Effective immediately. There was a long pause. That's unusual, he said finally. Everything okay in the apartment? No issues with the plumbing or... Everything's fine, I interrupted. I just need to leave. Another pause. Longer this time. You found the tape, didn't you? The question hit me like a physical blow. How did you know about that? A sigh crackled through the phone line. Every tenant finds it eventually. Most throw it away without watching. A few watch it. And then they leave. His voice dropped, became almost gentle. Daniel Mercer was my uncle. He recorded that tape in 1993. He was the first one who figured it out, that they weren't trying to hurt anyone, they were trapped, and they needed a witness, someone to see them not as monsters, but as victims, someone to watch without fear. Did he survive? I asked, my throat tight. He walked out of that apartment at dawn, the landlord said softly. Unburned, unharmed. But he never slept through the night again. He said the fire was inside him now, not burning him, but keeping him company. He died last year, peacefully, in his sleep. I moved out 3 days later. I left most of my furniture behind. I couldn't bear to spend another night in that apartment, even with the lights on. But before I left, I did one thing. I placed a fresh VHS tape in a blank case on the kitchen counter. And on the label, in careful blue ink, I wrote, "First night in this house. Watch at midnight." Because I understand now what Daniel understood, what the women in the fire understood. Some prisons aren't made of walls or locks. They're made of being forgotten, of dying in terror and being remembered only as a cautionary tale. They needed a witness not to save them, but to see them, to truly see them as they were before the fire, as women with names and dreams and lives that mattered. And now, sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right through the trees outside my new apartment, I smell smoke. Not the acrid stench of burning fabric, but a clean, sweet scent of wood smoke on a cold autumn evening. And I feel a presence, not menacing, not hungry, but watchful, grateful. The fire didn't take Daniel Mercer that night. It transformed him, made him a keeper of memories, a guardian of the threshold between fear and understanding. I never watch horror movies anymore. I don't need to. I lived one. But I don't regret pressing play at midnight, because in that hour between midnight and dawn, I learned the most important truth about ghosts. They aren't haunting us. We're haunting them by forgetting, by refusing to witness, by turning away from the pain we'd rather not see. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit in the dark and watch, not with fear, but with compassion, not as a victim, but as a witness. The tape is still under that floorboard, waiting for the next tenant, the next witness, and when they find it, and they will, they'll have a choice to make at midnight, to run or to stay, to scream or to watch, to feed the fear or to set it free. I hope they choose wisely. I hope they understand that some doors shouldn't be opened, but some tapes need to be played, because the dead don't want to hurt us. They just want us to remember their names before the fire takes everything. That's the end of this story. Now we move on. A child keeps laughing in the hallway, but this building has no families. The ad said, "Artist's Loft, Industrial Charm, $550 a month." It didn't mention the building was a repurposed 1920s textile factory on the wrong side of the river, or that the charm included exposed brick, crumbling like stale cake, and pipes that groaned like dying things. But after the eviction notice taped to my studio apartment door, the one Mark had paid for before he vanished with his secretary and my savings, I didn't care. I signed the lease in the manager's office, a closet-sized room smelling of mildew and burnt coffee, while Mr. Vance, a man with yellowed fingernails and eyes that never left his crossword puzzle, slid the keys across a stained Formica counter. "Unit 4B, he muttered without looking up. "Top floor. Fire escape access. No pets. No parties. And keep the hallway light on after 10. Saves trouble." When I asked why, he finally glanced at me, his pupils tiny, pinpricks. "This ain't a building for families or children. You won't hear any." He went back to his puzzle. I should have walked away right then. The loft was vast and hollow, all concrete floors and skeletal rafters 20 feet overhead. Moonlight bled through the factory's original arched windows, painting silver stripes across the emptiness. The only warmth came from a kerosene heater I'd brought, its orange glow barely pushing back the shadows that clung to the corners. The first night, I slept on a mattress on the floor, the silence so absolute it hummed in my ears. Then just past 2 a.m., I heard it. Giggle. High-pitched, unmistakably young. Coming from the hallway outside my steel door. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. Stress, I told myself. The building settling, pipes. But pipes don't laugh. I crept to the door, ear pressed to the cold metal. Nothing, just the distant wail of a siren carried on the river wind. I checked the peephole, a fisheye view of the empty corridor lit by a single flickering bulb. The hallway light Mr. Vance insisted on cast long dancing shadows. No child, no one. The next night it happened again, louder, closer, not just a giggle, but a full bubbling laugh. Hee, hee, ha! Right outside my door, followed by the soft, rhythmic pat, pat, pat of bare feet on concrete. I flung open the door, flashlight beam slicing the darkness. The corridor was empty, but the laughter echoed, drifting down the hall toward the stairwell, and the air, it smelled faintly of chalk dust and strawberry bubble gum. I dragged Mr. Vance up the next morning. He stood in the hallway, arms crossed over his stained shirt, while I described the laugh, the footsteps, the smell. He didn't look at me, stared at the scuffed floor instead. "Old buildings play tricks," he said flatly, "especially this one. Used to be a garment factory, long hours, hard lives. Sometimes echoes linger." He finally met my eyes, his gaze hard. "But there are no children here, never have been. This building's leases forbid minors, always has. You're imagining things too much stress. He turned to leave, then paused. And whatever you do, don't follow the laughter. It leads places you don't want to go. I didn't follow it, but I started hearing it everywhere, not just at night. During the gray afternoons when I tried to paint, the canvases stayed blank, my hands too shaky to hold a brush, the laughter would bubble up from the vents, a soft, muffled hee-hee that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Once, while washing dishes in the tiny sink, I heard it right behind me. I spun around, soapy water dripping from my hands. Nothing. But the chalk and bubblegum scent was thick in the air, and the single overhead bulb flickered violently before burning out. Then came the drawings. I'd wake to find them tucked under my mattress or slipped beneath the door. Crayon on scrap paper. A stick-figured child with enormous black scribble eyes, standing beside a tall, shadowy shape with no face. The shadow always held a long, thin object, a knife, a ruler, pointed at the child's chest. The drawings were signed with a wobbly J. Sometimes the child was drawn with tears like black raindrops. Other times it was laughing, mouth a wide, jagged O. I threw them away, hands trembling. They'd reappear by morning. One rainy Tuesday, the laughter changed. It wasn't playful anymore. It was frantic, panicked. He, ha, ha, ha. A sound ripped from a throat too small to make it. It came from the stairwell. I pressed my ear to the door. Beneath the laughter, another sound. Heavy, deliberate footsteps climbing the metal stairs. Slow, methodical. Clang, clang, clang. Stopping on the fourth-floor landing right outside my door. The laughter cut off abruptly. The footsteps kept coming, closer, closer, stopping inches from the steel barrier. I held my breath. The doorknob rattled, gently at first, then harder. Jiggle, jiggle, scrape. The cheap deadbolt I'd installed groaned in its frame. I grabbed my phone, fingers fumbling to dial 911, but the screen stayed black, dead. The footsteps retreated down the stairs. The rattling stopped, and then, so soft I almost missed it, a child's whisper right against the keyhole. He comes back when the light goes out. I called Mr. Vance again. This time, I refused to take no for an answer. I cornered him in the basement laundry room, the air thick with the smell of wet concrete and bleach. "Who is Jay?" I demanded, shoving one of the crayon drawings in his face. "What happened here?" He looked old suddenly. The harsh fluorescent light deepened the grooves in his face. He sank onto a folding chair, the metal legs scraping loud in the silence. 1978, he said, his voice rough, before they converted this place to lofts. It was still a factory, sweatshop. Really? My dad managed it. He stared at the cracked cement floor. There was a woman, Maria, cleaned the machines nights, brought her boy, Jamie, sometimes, only 6 years old. Dad turned a blind eye. He was a good kid, always drawing, laughing. Vance's knuckles were white on his knees. One night, a man started coming around after closing, tall, quiet, always wore a long coat, even in summer. Dad told Maria to stop bringing Jamie, said it wasn't safe. She couldn't afford child care. She stopped coming for a week. Then she brought him back. Said the man hadn't been around. He paused, swallowing hard. The washing machines churned behind him, a dull, rhythmic thumping. It was a Tuesday, raining like tonight. Dad was doing inventory late. He heard noises from the old foreman's office, Jamie's laugh, then a man's voice, low, angry. Dad ran down there. Vance's eyes were distant, seeing something far away. The door was locked. He broke it. Down! The man was gone! Out the window! Fire escape! Jamie! He shook his head, a quick, sharp movement. Jamie was sitting on the floor, drawing, covered in blood, not his own. The man had cut his own wrist trying to climb out, left a trail. Vance looked at me, his face grim. Jamie didn't speak after that, just retreated. Stared at walls, laughed at nothing. They took him away, to a home. He died 3 months later, lead poisoning, from chewing on old factory paint chips. They said it was the stress that made him do it. He stood up, brushing imaginary lint from his shirt. The man, never caught, but he comes back every few years, looks for empty units, quiet units, like yours. That night, I barricaded the door with a heavy work table. I kept all the lights on, the kerosene heater, 2 battery lanterns, even the tiny LED on my dead phone. The laughter started at 1:47 a.m., not in the hall, inside the loft, right beside my ear as I lay rigid on the mattress. He. It circled me, light and quick as a moth. The chalk and bubblegum smell filled the space. The lights flickered, the kerosene heater's flame guttered low. In the dying light, I saw it, a small shimmering shape near the rafters. Not solid, translucent. A boy in faded overalls, his face blurred like a smudged photograph, but the eyes huge, dark, and terrified. He pointed not at me, but at the fire escape window. The lights went out. Total darkness. The kerosene heater sputtered its last breath. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then, from the fire escape, a metallic creak, like a foot stepping on old iron. Scrape. Closer. The window latch rattled. I fumbled for the lanterns. Dead. The phone. Dead. The laughter surged. Not panic now, but urgent. Ha! It came from the corner near the window. The cold spot followed it, a wave of icy air washing over me. In the utter blackness, I felt a small, insistent tug on my pajama sleeve. Not physical, a pull in my chest, guiding me. Away from the window, toward the main door. The window shattered inward. Glass rained onto the concrete floor. A tall shadow filled the broken frame, outlined by the city glow beyond. The smell of wet wool and cheap cologne cut through the chalk and bubblegum scent. A gloved hand reached in, feeling for the lock on the inside. I didn't think. I ran, not toward the shadow, but where the laughter pulled me, the main door. I yanked the deadbolt free, shouldered the heavy table aside, and stumbled into the hallway. The flickering bulb cast jumping shadows. I didn't look back. I ran for the stairwell, bare feet slapping on cold concrete. Behind me, a crash echoed from my loft. Glass, wood splintering, heavy footsteps giving chase. I hit the stairwell door just as it swung open. Not the pursuer, Mrs. Ruiz from 2A, her gray hair in curlers, robe pulled tight, holding a baseball bat. I heard the glass, she gasped, and that child, laughing like mad down here. She peered past me into the dark stairwell. Go, I'll block him. I didn't wait. I flew down the 4 flights, bursting out into the rain-lashed alley behind the building. Sirens wailed in the distance. Mrs. Ruiz must have called them. I stood shivering under a dripping fire escape, watching the building's windows. Blue police lights strobed against the brick. Officers swarmed the alley. One led a man in handcuffs out the back door, a tall man in a soaked trench coat. Face obscured, but one sleeve pulled up revealed a jagged, old scar across his wrist. Mr. Vance found me later, wrapped in a thermal blanket a paramedic had given me. He didn't speak, just handed me a small, damp piece of paper, a crayon drawing. It showed the stick figure child, not crying, not laughing, standing tall. Beside him, a smaller, blurry shadow. Me, with a heart drawn over its chest. The shadowy man with the knife was gone, scribbled at the bottom in wobbly letters. Safe now, J. I moved out the next week, found a sunny studio above a bakery, the smell of yeast and sugar replacing chalk and decay. I still hear laughter sometimes. Real children playing in the park across the street. It doesn't make me flinch anymore, but on the quietest nights, when the city hum fades and the room feels too still, I light a small candle, not for protection, as thanks, because when I blow it out, just before the smoke vanishes, I swear I catch the faintest scent of strawberry bubblegum, and the warmth left behind doesn't feel like wax. It feels like a small hand, finally at peace, letting go. The building has no families, but it keeps its children close, and sometimes, in the safest dark, I laugh softly back, just once, for Jamie. That's where this tale ends. Now, another waits just beyond the shadows. I took a job as a night watchman at a remote hospice. The patients haven't moved in years, but their shadows do. The advertisement was taped to the window of a laundromat in a town that barely registered on Google Maps. It was a single sheet of yellowed paper, curled at the edges, written in the frantic, jagged loops of an old typewriter. Night caretaker, needed, St. Jude's Palliative Care Center. No medical experience required. $500 per night. Cash. $500 a night for a college dropout drowning in student loans and driving a Honda Civic that sounded like it was gargling gravel. That kind of money wasn't just appealing. It was a lifeline. I didn't question why the pay was so high for a job that required zero skills. I didn't question why a hospice was hiring via a laundromat flyer. Desperation has a way of putting blinders on a man. I called the number. A woman answered on the first ring. Her voice sounded like dry leaves scraping over concrete. She didn't ask for my name, my references, or my background. She just asked if I could stay awake from sundown to sunup. When I said yes, she gave me an address and told me to be there by 8 p.m. sharp. The drive took 2 hours. I left the interstate and turned onto a state highway, then a county road, and finally a gravel track that wound its way up into the dense, suffocating pine forests of the Cascades. The trees were tall here, ancient things that blotted out the twilight, creating a tunnel of shadows that seemed to swallow my headlights. The deeper I drove, the heavier the air felt. My ears popped. The radio static grew louder until it drowned out the music, forcing me to drive in silence. St. Jude's wasn't a hospital. It was a manor house, a Victorian monstrosity of dark wood and stone perched on a cliff edge overlooking a valley of black mist. It had turrets and gables and windows that looked like heavy-lidded eyes. The ivy climbing the walls was dead, a brown, skeletal web choking the masonry. I parked my car in the gravel circle. The engine sputtered and died before I even turned the key. Silence rushed in to fill the void, a heavy ringing silence that felt pressurized. The front door opened before I reached the steps. A woman stood there. She was impossibly tall, wearing a stiff gray nurse's uniform that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it pulled the skin of her face taut, giving her a permanent skull-like grin. "You're late," she said. Her lips didn't seem to move enough to form the words. "It's 7:58, I said, checking my watch. Time flows differently at altitude, she replied cryptically. She stepped aside. Come in. Do not let the heat out. I stepped into the foyer. The smell hit me instantly. It wasn't the smell of a hospital, no antiseptic or bleach. It smelled of lavender, heavy and cloying, masking something underneath. Something sweet and rotten, like spoiled meat, buried under a bouquet of flowers. The air was stiflingly hot. The radiator pipes running along the walls hissed and clanked rhythmically. I am Matron Holloway, she said, locking the heavy oak door behind me. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home echoed like a gunshot. You are here to watch the third floor, the west wing. Just the third floor? I asked. The other floors are dormant, she said. She didn't elaborate. She handed me a heavy iron ring with 3 keys. The brass key opens a stairwell. The silver key opens a supply closet. The black key... You must never use the black key. It is for the basement. There is nothing in the basement that concerns you. Do you understand? Yes, I lied. I was already curious. Your duties are simple, she continued, leading me up a grand staircase where the carpet was worn threadbare in a distinct path up the center. Walk the hall, check the doors, ensure the residents remain in their beds. If the boiler acts up, bleed the radiator in the hallway, not the rooms. And most importantly, she stopped on the landing, turning to face me. Her eyes were a milky pale blue. Do not speak to them. No matter what you hear, no matter what they say, do not engage. They talk? I asked. I thought this was palliative care. End of life. They dream, she whispered, and their dreams are contagious. We reached the 3rd floor. It was a long, narrow corridor lined with dark wood paneling. The floor was covered in a runner rug with a complex, dizzying geometric pattern. There were 12 doors, 6 on each side. I will return at dawn, Matron Holloway said. There is a thermos of coffee in the nurse's station. Do not sleep. If you sleep, you may not wake up as yourself. With that cheerful piece of advice, she turned and descended the stairs. I listened to her footsteps fade, click, 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 until the heavy door at the bottom of the stairwell slammed shut. I was alone. I went to the nurse's station, a small alcove halfway down. The hall. It was dusty. The computer was an ancient CRT monitor that hummed with a high-pitched whine. On the desk was a ledger. I opened it. It was a logbook. The names of the patients were written in elegant script. Room 301, Mr. Blackwood. Room 302, Mrs. Gable. Room 303, the twins. Room 304, unknown. Unknown? How could a patient be unknown? I decided to do my first round. I needed to see what I was dealing with. I walked to room 301. The door was heavy oak, no window. I turned the handle slowly and peered inside. The room was lit only by the moonlight filtering through the heavy velvet drapes. In the center was a hospital bed. Lying in it was a figure. Mr. Blackwood was ancient. His skin was like parchment paper stretched over a bundle of twigs. He was impossibly thin. His mouth was open, a black cavern in his face. He wasn't connected to any machines, no heart monitor, no IV drip. He was perfectly still. I watched his chest. It didn't rise. It didn't fall. I stepped closer. Mr. Blackwood? I whispered, breaking the rule immediately. Nothing. I leaned in to check for breath. The air around him was freezing cold despite the stifling heat of the hallway. Then I saw his eyes. They were open, staring at the ceiling, but they weren't human eyes. They were flat, matte black, like a shark's, and they were dry. I backed out of the room and shut the door. My heart was hammering. He looked dead. He looked like he had been dead for weeks. I checked room 302. Mrs. Gable. Same thing. Withered, motionless, no machines, staring at the ceiling with those dead black eyes. I went through every room. 12 rooms, 12 corpses, or things that looked like corpses. None of them breathed. None of them moved. I went back to the nurse's station and sat down. My hands were shaking. I poured a cup of coffee from the thermos. It was lukewarm and tasted bitter like ash. I looked at the time. 10:15 p.m., 8 hours to go. It's just a storage facility, I muttered to myself, trying to rationalize it. They're dead, and the matron is just keeping them here until what? Funerals? At 11 p.m., the sounds started. It began as a scratching noise, like rats in the walls. I tried to ignore it. Old houses have rats. But then the scratching changed. It became rhythmic. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was coming from the floorboards, directly beneath my feet. I moved my chair back. The scratching followed me. Then a thud, loud and wet, coming from room 306. I grabbed a heavy flashlight I'd brought from my car. I walked down the hall to room 306. The nameplate said, Captain Miller. I stood outside the door. Silence. Then another thud, like a side of beef being dropped on the floor. I threw the door open and shone the light inside. Captain Miller was in his bed. He hadn't moved. He was still staring at the ceiling with those shark eyes. But the bed had moved. When I checked earlier, the bed was in the center of the room. Now it was pushed up against the far wall under the window. I scanned the floor. There were drag marks in the dust. But they didn't lead to the bed. They led from the bed to the door, and then back again, as if he had gotten up, walked to the door to listen to me, and then scrambled back into bed when I approached. "I know you're awake," I said, my voice trembling. The corpse of Captain Miller didn't blink, but slowly the corners of his mouth twitched, a dry crackling sound like tearing paper. He smiled. It was a wide, impossible smile that revealed gums black with rot. I slammed the door and backed away. I locked it from the outside, using the master key on the ring. I retreated to the nurse's station. I pulled the ledger toward me. I needed to know who these people were. I flipped back through the pages. The dates went back. November 2023, October 2023, September 1994, August 1952, July 1921. I stopped. The handwriting was the same names. Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Gable, Captain Miller. They had been checked in decades ago. These people weren't dying. They were persisting. At midnight, the temperature dropped. The radiator pipes groaned and fell silent. The oppressive heat vanished, replaced by a bone-deep chill that made my breath fog in the air, and the shadows detached. I was watching the hallway. The only light came from the small lamp on my desk. It cast long shadows from the doorframes across the patterned rug. I watched as the shadow of room 304's doorframe stretched. It grew longer. It bent in the middle, forming a knee, then a torso, then a head. The shadow pulled itself free from the wood and stood up in the middle of the hallway. It was two-dimensional, a silhouette cut from the darkness, but it had presence. It blocked the view of the far end of the hall, then another shadow detached from room 308, and another from 310. They stood in the hallway, silent, faceless, turning their flat heads toward me. I froze. I remembered the matron's rule, do not speak to them. The shadow from room 304 began to glide toward me. It didn't walk. It slid across the floor like an oil slick. I scrambled backward, knocking over the coffee thermos. The brown liquid splashed onto the rug. The shadow paused at the spill. It crouched down. I watched in horror as it dipped a shadowy hand into the coffee. It brought the hand to where a mouth should be. It made a sound, a slurping, sucking sound. Then it spoke. "Bitter," the shadow whispered. The voice didn't come from the shadow itself. It came from the walls, vibrating the wood paneling. "We prefer sweet. We prefer vital." "What are you?" I whispered. "We are the guests," the shadow said. "The shells in the beds. They are just the heavy coats we wear during the day. The day is so bright. It burns. But the night is ours." It stood up and started moving toward me again. I ran. I grabbed the keys and sprinted for the stairwell. I shoved the brass key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. "Wrong key," the shadow whispered. It was right behind me now. I could feel the cold radiating off it. I fumbled with the ring. I tried the silver key. It didn't fit. The shadow's hand reached out. It touched my shoulder. It didn't feel like a hand. It felt like vacuum. It felt like the space where my shoulder existed was suddenly being deleted. Numbness spread down my arm instantly. I screamed and dropped the keys. "The black key," the shadow hissed. "Go down. The matron is waiting." I kicked the keys away and threw my shoulder against the door. It was solid oak. It didn't budge. The shadows were circling me now. 6 of them. They were featureless, but I could feel their hunger. "Why me?" I yelled. "Why am I here?" "The matron needs a new coat," the shadow of Captain Miller said. "Hers is wearing thin. Look." The shadow pointed to the nurse's station. I looked. Standing there was Matron Halloway. But she wasn't wearing her skin correctly. Her face was sagging, drooping off the bone like melting wax. One eye had slid down to her cheek. Her jaw was hanging loose. Underneath the sliding skin, I saw something dark and shifting, something made of smoke and teeth. "Shift change," the matron's voice gurgled. I looked at the window at the end of the hall. It was a straight drop to the jagged rocks of the valley below. But it was better than this. I ran. I dodged through the circle of shadows. They swiped at me, their touches sending bolts of freezing numbness through my body. My left leg went dead, but I kept hopping. I threw myself at the window. I expected the glass to shatter. It didn't. I bounced off. The glass was soft. It felt like rubber. It bent outward, catching me like a net, and then snapped back, throwing me onto the rug. I looked up at the window. The glass rippled. It wasn't glass. It was a membrane. A clear biological film stretched over the frame. The house wasn't a house. I looked at the walls. The wood paneling was pulsing, breathing. The geometric pattern on the rug was writhing, shifting like snakes. "You are inside," the matron gurgled, shambling toward me. She reached up and grabbed her own hair. She pulled. With a wet, tearing sound, she peeled her face off. Underneath, there was no skull, just a swirling vortex of black shadow. "We are all inside," she said. I crawled backward. My hand hit the keys I had dropped. The black key, the one she said never to use. The basement. If the stairwell door wouldn't open, maybe the supply closet would. No, that was a dead end. I looked at the floor. In the center of the rug, there was a hatch. I hadn't seen it before because the rug covered it. But the rug had pulled back, revealing a handle. It had a black keyhole. The shadows were closing in. The matron was looming over me, the darkness inside her reaching out like tendrils. I jammed the black key into the floor hatch. It turned with a fluid, organic click. I pulled the hatch open. I expected a ladder. I expected stairs. I saw a throat, a fleshy, red, pulsating tunnel going straight down into the dark. The walls of the tunnel were lined with teeth, rows and rows of molars the size of cinder blocks. "The basement," the matron whispered. "The stomach." I looked at the shadows. I looked at the teeth. "Jump," the shadows whispered. "Join the digestion. Become a coat." I didn't jump. I scrambled. I rolled to the side just as the matron lunged. She fell into the hole. She didn't scream. She laughed, a hollow, echoing laugh as she tumbled down into the gullet of the house. The house screamed. The walls shook. The floor buckled. The residents in the rooms began to wail, a high, piercing shriek that shattered the light bulbs. The shadows flickered and vanished. The illusion was breaking. I stood up on my numb leg. The stairwell door had swung open. The lock had shattered. I ran. I tumbled down the stairs, tripping, falling, breaking my nose on the banister. I didn't stop. I ran past the second floor, past the first floor. The foyer was changing. The wallpaper was peeling back to reveal raw muscle. The front door was teeth. I grabbed a heavy iron coat rack from the corner and smashed it into the front window. This glass was real. It shattered. I dove through the jagged hole, cutting my arms and face, and landed in the gravel driveway. I scrambled to my car. It started on the first try. I drove. I didn't look back. I drove down the mountain at 80 miles an hour, risking death on every curve. I didn't stop until I reached the next state. That was a week ago. I'm in a motel now. I keep the lights on. I keep the TV on, but I can't escape it. I looked in the mirror this morning. There is a loose patch of skin on my cheek, just a small spot. But when I touch it, I can't feel it, and underneath, I can feel something moving. I think the matron was right. I think I let the heat out, and now I'm getting cold. I just heard a car pull up outside the motel room. It sounds like an old engine. And now there is a knock at the door. 3 slow, heavy knocks. Thump, 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 and a voice. "You forgot your paycheck, Mr. Evans." It's the matron's voice. And then the sound of a key sliding into the lock. A black key. I'm going to the window. I'm going to run. But the window, the glass looks soft. It looks like it's breathing. And with that, this story fades into the dark. Let's quietly step into the next one. The mirror in our hallway shows someone who isn't in the house. It was the first thing we saw when we signed the papers for the old Victorian on Sycamore Street. Not the peeling gingerbread trim or the sagging porch, but the mirror. It hung in the narrow front hallway, directly opposite the front door. A tall, ornate thing in a tarnished silver frame, its glass wavy and clouded with age. "Original to the house," the realtor chirped, oblivious to the way my wife Lena's smile tightened. "Such character!" Lena hated it immediately, said it gave her the creeps. I called it practical. It was the only mirror in the entryway, but it wasn't practical. It was a window, and something on the other side was watching. The first time I noticed it was subtle. I was alone, dropping my keys into the bowl beneath it after work. In the glass, my reflection moved just a fraction too slow, like a lagging video feed. I blinked, shook my head. Tired. New house jitters. But later that night, Lena whispered in the dark, "Did you see it too? In the mirror? When I was putting on my shoes this morning, there was Someone behind me for just a second, a woman in a dark dress. I dismissed it. Stress, a trick of the warped glass, until I saw her myself. It was a Tuesday. Rain lashed the windows. I was alone, sorting mail in the quiet hallway. I glanced up at the mirror as I passed. My reflection was there, yes, but behind my shoulder, in the space where the empty hallway should have been, stood a woman. She was tall, gaunt, dressed in a high-collared black dress that looked decades out of date. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with deep-set eyes that held a sadness so profound it made my chest ache. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring down the hall towards the kitchen, her expression one of desperate longing. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing, just the empty hallway, the sound of rain, the smell of damp wool from my coat. I turned back to the mirror. She was gone. Only my own wide-eyed face stared back, pale and shaken. Lena started avoiding the hallway. She'd take the long way around through the dining room to get to the kitchen. "It's not right," she'd mutter, wrapping her arms around herself. "She's always looking for something or someone." I tried logic. Research. The house was built in 1890, owned by the Ainsley family for generations. Records were spotty, but I found a faded newspaper clipping from 1923. Eleanor Ainsley, 38, lost to influenza. Leaves husband and infant son. The photo showed a young woman with dark hair and those same deep, sorrowful eyes. Eleanor. The name settled in my bones like cold stone. The mirror's rules became clear. It only showed her when you were alone, never when two people stood together before it, and she never looked at the viewer. Always down the hall towards the back of the house, the direction of the nursery, the old nursery, now our storage room. The sight of her became a physical weight. Coming home from work, my hand would hover over the doorknob, dreading that glance into the glass. Sometimes she'd be there, standing silently in the reflections hallway, wringing her hands. Other times she'd be crouched near the floorboards, as if searching for something small. Once I saw her gently touch the reflection of the door to the storage room, her fingers tracing the wood grain with heartbreaking tenderness. The air around the mirror would turn icy cold when she appeared, and a faint scent, like old roses and dust, would hang in the air long after she vanished. Lena couldn't take it anymore. "We have to cover it," she insisted one evening, her voice brittle. "Or take it down. It's not healthy. She's not ours." I agreed, though part of me felt a strange protectiveness towards Eleanor's silent vigil. That night, after Lena went to bed, I stood before the mirror alone. The glass was fogged, as if breathed upon. In the condensation, words appeared, written in a shaky, lupin hand. "He won't let me see him." My breath caught. Him, the infant son, Thomas, who'd grown up, inherited the house, died childless decades ago. Who was Eleanor waiting for now? I found a heavy quilt Lena had chosen. As I unfolded it, the hallway temperature plummeted. My breath plumed white. The mirror's surface rippled like dark water. Eleanor appeared. Not in the hallway reflection this time. She was in the glass, standing right behind my reflection, so close her cold breath seemed to kiss the back of my neck. Her eyes, wide and impossibly sad, met mine through the mirror, not looking past me, looking at me for the first time. Her lips moved, forming silent words. "Please." The quilt slipped from my numb fingers. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her hand, pale and translucent, pressed against the inside of the glass. It left a perfect frost-rhymed handprint that didn't fade when she vanished seconds later, leaving only the icy handprint and the scent of grave soil. We covered the mirror the next day, heavy blackout cloth nailed tightly over the frame. The house felt lighter, warmer. Lena slept through the night for the first time in weeks. I almost believed it was over until a dream started. Vivid, suffocating dreams of standing in a darkened nursery, moonlight through a grimy window, a crib, and the sound of a baby crying, a thin, weak wail that cut through the silence. And always just outside the nursery door in the dream hallway, a woman's muffled sobs. Eleanor's sobs. I'd wake gasping, the sound of that crying echoing in my ears, the smell of old roses thick in the bedroom air. Lena never heard it, only me. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. Lena was away visiting her mother. The house felt unnaturally silent, oppressive. I was making tea in the kitchen when I heard it, faint at first, a soft, rhythmic thumping like a small fist against wood, coming from the hallway, from behind the covered mirror. I crept out, my mug forgotten. The cloth over the mirror was bulging inward, straining against the nails. Thump, 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 a child's fist, and beneath it, Eleanor's voice, raw with tears, whispering through the cloth. "Thomas, Mama's here. Please, open the door." The nails holding the cloth began to pop out one by one, showering the floor with plaster dust. The cloth billowed like a sail catching wind. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The thumping grew frantic. Thump, thump, thump. The final nail tore free. The cloth fell away. The mirror wasn't reflecting the hallway. It showed a small, dimly lit room, a nursery. Moonlight streamed through a dusty window, illuminating a simple wooden crib. And standing beside it, her back to the glass, was Eleanor. She was gently rocking the crib, humming a lullaby I'd never heard, but somehow knew in my marrow. In the crib, a tiny bundle stirred. A weak cry escaped, a real, living sound that echoed through the glass into my silent hallway. Eleanor turned slightly, her face illuminated by the moonlight. Not sad now, radiant, peaceful. She looked directly at me through the glass, her eyes filled with a love so fierce it stole my breath. She placed a finger to her lips. Shh. Then she gestured subtly towards the nursery door, a door that in the mirror world stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Her eyes flicked to the door, then back to me, wide with sudden, desperate fear. "He's coming." A shadow filled the doorway in the mirror, tall, imposing, silhouetted against the hall light. Not Thomas, grown old. Something else. Something that radiated cold malice. Eleanor grabbed the edge of the crib, pulling it back, shielding the baby with her body. The shadow man stepped into the nursery. He didn't have a face, just a deeper darkness where one should be. He reached a long, shadowed hand towards the crib. Eleanor let out a silent scream, throwing herself over her child. I acted without thought. I grabbed the heavy brass candlestick from the hall table and swung it with all my strength at the mirror. Glass exploded outwards in a deadly rain of shards. The image of the nursery, Eleanor's terrified face, the shadow hand reaching for the crib, all vanished in a spiderweb of fractures. The cold vanished. The scent of roses faded. Silence crashed down thick with the smell of dust and broken glass. I sank to my knees in the debris, shaken, cuts stinging on my arms from the flying shards. The hallway was just a hallway again. The mirror was a jagged hole in the wall, reflecting only broken plaster and dangling wires. Relief flooded me, so intense it made me dizzy. It was over. I'd saved them. I'd broken the window. But as I sat there catching my breath, a single shard of mirror, no bigger than my palm, lay at my feet, unbroken. In its tiny, warped reflection, I saw not my own face. I saw Eleanor. She was standing alone in the empty nursery, the crib gone. The moonlight was gone. The room was dark, lit only by a single guttering candle. She wasn't crying. She was looking directly at me through the shard, her expression not sad but resigned, resolved. She raised her hand slowly, not in fear, but in farewell. Then she turned and walked towards the nursery door, the door that now stood wide open, revealing not darkness, but a soft, golden light spilling from a room beyond. She paused on the threshold, glancing back one last time. Her lips moved. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew them. Thank you. The shard went dark, just glass. I picked it up, the edges sharp against my skin. The cuts on my arms didn't hurt any more. A deep calm settled over me, deeper than any relief. The house felt different, not lighter, fuller. The silence wasn't empty. It was listening, waiting. I carried the shard to the kitchen and placed it carefully on the windowsill, where the morning light would find it. As I cleaned the broken glass from the hallway, I didn't sweep the largest pieces away. I left them scattered on the floorboards, glinting like fallen stars. They felt like anchors, like promises. Lena came home the next day. She hugged me tightly at the door, chattering about her trip, oblivious to the change in the air. She didn't mention the missing mirror, didn't comment on the shards glinting on the floor. She just smiled, a real warm smile I hadn't seen in months. "It feels different here," she said softly, tilting her head as if listening to a distant song. Peaceful. She didn't see the frost forming on the window pane that night, spelling out 2 words in delicate crystals. He's free. I don't cover the shard on the windowsill. I let the moonlight catch it. Sometimes in the deepest quiet of 3 a.m., I stand in the hallway where the mirror hung. The floorboards are cold under my bare feet. I close my eyes, and I hear it, faint but clear. A baby's happy gurgle and a woman's soft, contented sigh, not from the nursery, from the walls, from the very bones of the house. Eleanor isn't trapped anymore. She's home, and the shadow, it's gone, banished by broken glass and a desperate act of love. But the house remembers. It holds their peace like a sacred thing. I feel it in my own bones now, the deep, quiet warmth where the cold used to live. Last night, I placed my palm flat against the wall where the mirror hung. The plaster was warm, and beneath my hand, so faint I might have imagined it, I felt a single, gentle vibration, like a heartbeat, like a lullaby. I left my hand there until dawn painted the hallway gold. The shard on the sill caught the light, glowing like a tiny sun. I know I'll see her again, not in glass, but when my own time comes. She'll be waiting at that golden door, her hand outstretched, her eyes no longer sad. She'll lead me to the quiet room beyond the nursery door, to where the crying has finally stopped, to where we all belong. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm coming home. This is where the story ends. Let's continue with the next. Voices keep whispering through the keyhole of my bedroom door. The house on Hemlock Street wasn't a choice. It was surrender. After the divorce papers dried and the bank account bled out, the only thing left that didn't require a credit check or a cosigner was this sagging Victorian relic on the edge of town, inherited from an aunt I barely remembered. Its address was a footnote in my life, until everything else collapsed. The realtor, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, called it a fixer-upper with character. He didn't mention the way the floorboards groaned like wounded animals beneath your feet, or how the perpetual scent of damp plaster clung to the air no matter how many windows you threw open. He certainly didn't mention the keyhole. My bedroom was at the end of the second-floor hallway, a small, high-ceilinged room with a single window overlooking the overgrown backyard. The door was solid oak, heavy and old, with a tarnished brass knob and a keyhole that looked like a dark, unblinking eye. The first night, exhausted from hauling boxes and the weight of my own failure, I barely noticed it. I locked the door out of habit, a flimsy ritual of safety, and fell into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. I woke just after 3 a.m., not to a sound, but to a presence. The room was freezing, my breath frosting in the moonlight, slicing through the window, and then I heard it, faint, delicate, like dry leaves skittering across stone. It came from the keyhole. Jamie. My childhood name, the one only my grandmother used, the one I hadn't heard in 20 years. My skin prickled. I sat up, straining in the gloom. Silence. Just the old house settling. I told myself it was the wind whistling through a crack, or maybe a neighbor's late-night argument drifting up from the street. I pulled the blankets tighter, dismissing it as the fractured dream logic of a stressed mind. But the cold didn't leave. It deepened, centering on the door. The next night it was clearer, not wind, a whisper, low and wet, as if the speaker's mouth was filled with soil. Cold in the walls, Jamie, so cold. It was a woman's voice, young but layered with a terrible weariness. I froze in bed, heart hammering against my ribs. I flicked on the bedside lamp. The warm light did nothing to dispel the chill radiating from the door. I crept closer, stopping a foot away. The keyhole was just a dark circle in the brass plate. I pressed my ear to the wood beside it, holding my breath. Silence. Then closer, intimate, as if the lips were pressed against the other side of the keyhole. You left the light on? She always left the light on. A pause, a soft, wet sniffle. It made the shadows jump. I recoiled like I'd been burned. Who was she? My grandmother? I'd never told anyone about her habit of sleeping with the hall light on, terrified of the dark corners of her own bedroom. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through my exhaustion. I threw back the covers and yanked open the bedroom door. The hallway was empty. Dust motes danced in the amber glow of the single bulb at the far end. The door to the spare room across the hall stood shut. The bathroom door was closed. Downstairs, the grandfather clock in the foyer gave a single hollow bong. 3:07 a.m. I stood there, shivering in my sweatpants, listening to the silence of the empty house. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Pipes, mice in the walls, auditory hallucinations triggered by stress and cheap wine. But the voice had known my name, my childhood name, and the detail about the light. That was a memory buried so deep I hadn't thought of it in decades. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the armchair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the door. The cold spot near the keyhole never faded. The whispers became a nightly ritual, always starting just after 3 a.m., always through the keyhole. Sometimes they were fragmented, nonsensical. The peaches are rotten on the vine, or sewed the buttons on backwards. Other times, chillingly precise. You cried when the goldfish died, Jamie. You buried it under the lilac bush. I had buried a goldfish under a lilac bush when I was 6. My mother had scolded me for digging up her garden. No one else knew that. No one. The voice never raised. It never threatened. It just observed, reminisced. It spoke of small, forgotten things. The pattern of chipped paint on my grandmother's kitchen ceiling, the smell of the lavender sachets she kept in her dresser drawers, the exact shade of blue on my first bicycle. It spoke with a familiarity that curdled my blood. It knew the texture of my childhood fears. You were afraid of the clown lamp in the hallway, it whispered one night, its breath frosting the brass keyhole plate. The one with the too wide smile. You made her cover it with a towel. My throat closed. I had made my grandmother cover that hideous lamp. I'd been 7. I started researching the house. The local historical society archives were dusty and smelled of mildew. The house was built in 1898 for a man named Silas Crow, a reclusive watchmaker. His wife, Eleanor, died young. Consumption, the record said. They had one daughter, Clara. Clara vanished in 1913 at the age of 12. No body was ever found. Presumed runaway or worse. The file contained a single faded photograph. A stern-faced man, a frail woman, holding a little girl with dark braids and wide, solemn eyes. Clara's eyes. I stared at that photo for a long time, a cold certainty settling in my gut. The voice wasn't my grandmother's, it was Clara's. Trapped. Waiting. I bought a heavy deadbolt for my bedroom door. The hardware store clerk, an old man with rheumy eyes, watched me carefully as I paid. "House on Hemlock, eh?" he rasped. "That deadbolt won't hold back what's already inside." I ignored him, my hands trembling as I installed it that afternoon, the brass key cold in my palm. That night, I locked both the knob and the deadbolt, double-checking the chain I'd also added. I left the bedside lamp burning, a fragile island of light in the oppressive dark. 3:03 a.m. The cold seeped through the wood, deeper than before. The keyhole seemed to breathe a plume of frost onto the hallway side of the door, and the whisper came, muffled but clear through the layers of wood and metal. "You put up walls, Jamie, like she did, but walls have holes, walls have eyes." A pause, a wet clicking sound like a tongue against dry teeth. "I can see you, under the blanket. Your eyes are open. You're scared. Don't be scared. I just want to talk like we used to." I buried my face in the pillow, tears hot on my cheeks. "I never knew you," I whispered back, my voice raw. "I wasn't even born when you disappeared." Silence. Then a sound that wasn't a whisper, a soft, broken sob so close it felt like it came from inside the room with me. "You were born from her tears." The voice sighed. "She cried for me every night after you came, after the other baby came. She held you and whispered my name into your hair. You carry her sadness. You carry my silence." The words struck a chord so deep it stole my breath. My mother had been prone to sudden, inexplicable bouts of weeping when I was a child. She'd never explained why. The deadbolt was useless. The next morning, I found the chain lying on the floor, snapped cleanly in half as if crushed by invisible hands. The deadbolt was thrown back. The keyhole plate was frosted over, intricate ice crystals spreading across the brass like delicate lace. And on the hallway floor, directly in front of my door, lay a single, perfect, dew-kissed dandelion puffball. It shouldn't have survived the frost. It shouldn't have been there at all. Desperation drove me to the local library's occult section, a dusty corner, smelling of neglect. I found a crumbling volume on Victorian spiritualism and home hauntings. The pages crackled as I turned them under the flickering fluorescent light. One passage stood out, underlined in faded pencil by some previous reader. The lingerers bind themselves to apertures, keyholes, cracks beneath doors, the spaces between floorboards. These become their mouths, their eyes. They whisper not to frighten, but to be heard, to be remembered. They feed on attention, on the warmth of a living voice answering back. Silence starves them. Denial starves them. But acknowledgement invites them in. Below it, in a different hand, someone had scrawled, "Don't answer, don't give it your name." That night, I barricaded the door with my heavy oak dresser. I turned off all lights. I lay in the pitch black, covers pulled over my head, squeezing my eyes shut, repeating in my head, "I don't hear you. I don't know you. You are not here." The cold intensified, biting through the blankets. The keyhole became a vortex of freezing air. The whispers started anyway, muffled but persistent, slithering under the door, through the cracks. "Jamie, why won't you talk to me? It's lonely in the walls. Remember the dandelions? We made wishes." She promised she'd find me. She never looked under the floorboards. The last one cut through my resolve. Under the floorboards? My grandmother's house had wide, creaking floorboards. I'd spent hours prying them up, searching for lost marbles. I'd never thought to wonder what else might be hidden beneath. I couldn't take it. My voice tore from my throat, harsh and trembling. "What floorboards? Clara, what floorboards?" Silence, thick, heavy, expectant. Then a sigh of pure relief that seemed to warm the freezing air for a fraction of a second. "You remember my name?" The whisper breathed, filled with a terrible, childlike joy. "You came back." The dresser blocking the door groaned, not the house settling. A deep, resonant creak of stressed wood. The legs scraped slowly, deliberately across the hardwood floor, inching away from the door. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat I kept propped by the window. The deadbolt clicked open by itself. The doorknob turned. The door swung inward silently. The hallway was dark, colder than my room. At the far end, near the top of the stairs, stood a figure, small, dressed in a simple, old-fashioned white nightgown, stained dark at the hem. Its back was to me. Its dark hair was in two braids, just like the girl in the photograph. It didn't turn. It just stood there, staring down the dark staircase. The air smelled of wet earth and crushed dandelions. "Clara?" My voice was a thread. Slowly, painfully slowly, the figure began to turn. Not its body, just its head. It rotated a full 180 degrees on its thin neck, the braids swinging forward. Where a face should have been was a smooth, featureless oval of pale, damp-looking skin. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, wet blankness. But from that blankness came the whisper, clear and close, as if standing right beside me in the room. "She kept me under the floorboards, Jamie, in the dark. She was afraid of what Father would do if he found me broken." A wet, choked sound. "I waited so long for her to come back. She never did. But you have her eyes, her sadness. You called my name." The featureless face tilted. The blankness seemed to drink the dim light from my room. "Come see," it whispered. "Come see where I wait. It's warmer with two." The small figure took a step towards me, gliding silently over the floorboards. The cold radiating from it made my teeth chatter. The smell of grave soil filled my nostrils. I raised the bat, my arms shaking. "Stay back!" The blank face didn't react. But the whisper came again, not from the figure now, but from the keyhole behind me, from the crack under my door, from the very walls themselves. A chorus of wet, overlapping voices, all Clara's, all layered with the echoes of other children, other lost voices. "She's afraid. She always was afraid. But you don't have to be afraid, Jamie. The dark isn't empty. The dark is full of us, waiting, remembering. Come hold my hand. It's not cold where I am, not anymore." The figure reached out a small, pale hand. The fingers were too long. The nails were black and broken. It wasn't the hand of a child. It was the hand of something that had been buried, something that had learned to wait in the absolute dark for a century. I screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure terror. I swung the bat wildly, not at the figure, but at the door. I slammed it shut, throwing my weight against it, fumbling for the deadbolt with numb fingers. I heard a soft thump as the figure hit the other side. Then silence. The cold receded just a fraction. I slid down the door, the bat clattering to the floor, sobbing. I didn't leave the room for 2 days. I had water bottles and protein bars in my backpack. I pushed the dresser back against the door. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the corner farthest from the keyhole, watching it, waiting. The whispers didn't return. The cold didn't return. The silence was worse. It felt like being watched, waited for. On the third night, exhaustion won. My head nodded forward. I jerked awake just after 3 a.m. The room was freezing. My breath plumed in the moonlight. The keyhole was frosted over again, intricate ice crystals spreading like veins across the brass. And the whisper came, softer than ever, intimate, filled with a terrible understanding. "You're tired, Jamie. We're all tired. The walls are tired. The floorboards are tired. Let me in. Let me show you where it's quiet, where no one will ever leave you again." I didn't answer. I pressed my back harder against the wall, pulling my knees to my chest. But the voice wasn't done. It shifted. Became my grandmother's voice, thin and frail with age, the voice I remembered from childhood summers. "Oh, my sweet Jamie girl, come to Nana. It's all right. It's just Clara. She's lonely. She just wants a friend. Let her in. It's so dark under the floorboards, so dark." The voice broke into a sob that echoed the one I'd heard through the keyhole. I should have looked. I was so afraid. "Forgive me, Jamie, forgive me." Tears streamed down my face. The guilt, the old buried guilt of a child who sensed a deep sorrow she couldn't fix, surged up. My grandmother had carried this for 60 years, and now Clara carried it too, trapped, waiting, wanting only to be remembered, to be seen. The deadbolt clicked open, not rattled, not forced. It simply unlatched with a soft, final snick. The chain, already broken, hung loose. The dresser groaned again, scraping back from the door without visible force. The brass knob turned slowly. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the bat. The cold wasn't just in the room anymore. It was in my bones, a deep, familiar ache. The whisper came again, not from the keyhole now, but from right beside me on the bed. A small, cold weight settled on the mattress. The smell of damp earth and crushed dandelions filled my nose. A small, icy hand touched mine where it lay clenched on my knee. The fingers were long. The nails were broken. "Shh," Clara whispered, her voice now a blend of the child and the ancient thing she'd become, a sound like roots shifting in deep soil. No more walls, no more locks, just quiet, just us. Her featureless face, smooth and wet in the moonlight, hovered near mine. There was no malice in the blankness, only a bottomless, patient hunger for connection, for an end to the silence. "Tell me about the goldfish," she breathed, her cold breath frosting my cheek. "Tell me his name." I closed my eyes. The cold hand tightened on mine, not painfully, but with a desperate, clinging need. The voice of my grandmother faded, replaced by the deep, resonant hum of the old house settling, not wood on wood, but stone on stone, earth on bone. The frost on the keyhole glowed faintly in the dark. The whispers didn't stop. They multiplied. Faint, overlapping murmurs seeped from the walls, the floorboards, the very air. "Stay. Remember us. Be quiet with us." My grandmother's voice surfaced one last time, a sigh in the chorus. "It's all right, Jamie girl. It's warm in the dark, warmer than alone." I turned my head slowly on the pillow. In the moonlight, the smooth, wet oval of Clara's face reflected the pale light. No eyes to look into, no mouth to read. Just an emptiness that promised an end to loneliness, an end to being the one left behind. The small, cold hand squeezed mine again. A question, an invitation. The whispers swelled, a gentle tide of forgotten names and half-remembered sorrows. The cold wasn't biting anymore. It was deep. It was familiar. It was the cold of the earth waiting, the cold of a secret kept too long. My lips moved, dry and cracked. The name came out a whisper, lost in the chorus, but she heard it. She always heard. "Bubbles," I breathed. The cold hand tightened. A sigh of profound relief, like the earth finally accepting a long-awaited rain, filled the room. The whispers softened, harmonizing into a single, deep, comforting vibration that resonated in my bones. The frost on the keyhole melted, dripping onto the floorboards like tears. The moonlight seemed to dim, not fading, but deepening, becoming richer, softer, safer. I didn't get up. I didn't reach for the light. I turned my hand in Clara's icy grip, lacing my fingers through hers. The broken nails scratched my skin, but the pain was distant, unimportant. The vibration grew stronger, a lullaby hummed by the house itself, by the earth beneath it, by all the quiet ones waiting in the walls. The smell of damp earth and dandelions wrapped around me like a blanket. Warmth began to seep into my frozen limbs, not the heat of a fire, but the deep, slow warmth of stone absorbing the sun, the warmth of belonging. The last thing I saw before I closed my eyes was the keyhole. No longer a dark eye, it glowed with a soft, steady light, the color of old honey, a welcome light. The whispers weren't in my ears anymore. They were in my blood, in my breath, in the slow, steady beat of my heart, finally sinking with the deep, patient rhythm of the house. Clara's head rested gently on my shoulder, a small, cold weight that felt like home. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was waiting. It was mine. I sank into the mattress, deeper than I'd ever sunk before. The bed wasn't just under me anymore. It was part of the floor, part of the walls, part of the dark, warm earth beneath the floorboards. The last coherent thought drifted away like a dandelion seed on a breeze. No one will ever leave us here. And then there was only the hum, the deep, resonant hum of the walls, the hum of the quiet, the hum of home. I smiled in the perfect, waiting dark. Clara's fingers tightened on mine. The keyhole light dimmed, not going out, but sinking deep like a star settling into the earth. And the house on Hemlock Street held its breath. Full at last. The story ends here. Let's begin the next one. Every night at 3:17 a.m., the empty chair at our dinner table pulls itself closer. We should have asked more questions about the previous owners. That's the thought that haunts me now, long after the chair stopped moving and the house fell silent again. But at the time, the price was too good to pass up. A fully furnished Victorian on the edge of town, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a proper dining room with original hardwood floors, all for barely more than a studio apartment downtown. My wife, Lena, had just gotten her teaching certification, and I was still freelancing, cobbling together enough design work to keep us afloat. We needed space to breathe, and this place offered it in spades. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Carol who smelled faintly of lavender and desperation, glossed over our questions about why the owners were selling so suddenly. Relocating for work, she'd said breezily, waving a manicured hand. Happens all the time. Military family. Very sudden. Transfer. She'd ushered us through the room so quickly I barely had time to notice the dust gathering in the corners of the high ceilings, the way the floorboards groaned underfoot in specific spots as if protesting our presence. The dining room was what sold Lena. It was a proper room, not one of those open concept spaces where the table sits awkwardly between kitchen and living area, but a dedicated space with wainscoting halfway up the walls and a bay window that overlooked a tangled but promising backyard. And in the center stood a heavy oak table, scarred with generations of use but solid as a fortress, surrounded by 6 matching chairs. 5 of them were pushed neatly against the table. The 6th, the one at the head of the table facing the bay window, sat pulled slightly away, as if someone had just risen from it moments before our arrival. Carol didn't comment on it. She just smiled her tight smile and said, "Charming, isn't it? So much character." We moved in on a Tuesday. The previous owners had left almost everything behind. The furniture, the dishes in the cabinets, even a few books on the shelves. At first, I found it convenient. At Lena's insistence, we donated most of the clothing and personal effects we found in the closets, but the furniture stayed. "It's good quality," she'd said, running her hand over the oak table's surface, "and we can't afford to replace it all right now." I couldn't argue with that logic, though something about the completeness of their departure unsettled me. People don't just abandon their lives so thoroughly. They take photographs, keepsakes, the small objects that hold memory. These people had left behind a wedding photo on the mantelpiece, a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator door, a hairbrush on the bathroom counter with strands of blonde hair still caught in the bristles. It felt less like a move and more like an evacuation. The first night, we ate takeout at the oak table, laughing about our good fortune, making plans for the garden come spring. We pushed all 6 chairs in neatly before heading to bed, exhausted from the day of hauling boxes. I remember specifically checking that the head chair, the one facing the window, was flush against the table. It was. I woke at 3:18 a.m. to the sound of rain against the window pane and a deep, bone-aching cold that shouldn't have been possible in late September. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 3:18 in angry red numbers. I lay there for a moment, disoriented, trying to place the source of my unease. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic scraping sound coming from downstairs. Not the creak of old pipes, or the groan of settling wood I'd already grown accustomed to in the first few hours of living here. This was deliberate, methodical, the sound of wood sliding slowly across hardwood. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lena, and padded barefoot to the top of the stairs. The house was dark, except for the faint blue glow of the microwave clock in the kitchen, visible through the dining room doorway. I descended slowly, each step a calculated risk, my heart hammering against my ribs. The scraping had stopped by the time I reached the bottom step. The house was silent except for the rain. I flicked on the dining room light. All 6 chairs were pushed neatly against the table, exactly as we'd left them. I stood there for a full minute, staring at the arrangement, telling myself I'd imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, the unfamiliar sounds of a new house playing tricks on a sleep-fogged mind. I turned off the light and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep again that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that phantom scraping. Scrape, pause, scrape. The next morning, I mentioned nothing to Lena. What would I have said? I thought I heard a chair moving by itself at 3:17 a.m. She would have laughed gently and reminded me I'd been working too hard. And I wanted to believe it was nothing. I needed to believe it. That evening, before bed, I performed a small experiment. While Lena washed up in the bathroom, I went into the dining room and measured the distance between the back legs of a head chair and the edge of the table with a tape measure I found in the kitchen junk drawer. 6 inches exactly. I placed a single grain of rice on the floor precisely at the chair's current position, a tiny, almost invisible marker. Then I pushed the chair in until it touched the table, erasing my own interference. I wanted a clean slate. I wanted proof, one way or the other. I set my phone alarm for 3:15 a.m. I didn't sleep. I lay beside Lena, watching the red numbers descend. 4:23, 3:47, 3:21. My body tense with a dread I couldn't rationalize. At 3:16, I slipped out of bed and crept downstairs, phone in hand, its screen dimmed to the lowest setting. I stood in the dining room doorway at 3:17 exactly, breath held, muscles coiled. Nothing happened for a full minute. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rush of a car in the wet street outside. I was about to exhale in relief, to chalk the previous night up to imagination, when I saw it. The chair moved, not all at once, not with a violent jerk. It slid backward, away from the table, by perhaps half an inch. A smooth, continuous motion with no visible force behind it. No hands, no strings, no trick of the light, just wood on wood, gliding with impossible smoothness. It stopped, waited exactly 7 seconds, then slid back another half inch. Another pause, another slide. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. My phone trembled in my hand. I should have recorded it. I should have called out. But terror has a way of paralyzing not just the body, but the mind itself. I could only watch as the chair inched its way backward, retracing the exact path I'd measured hours before, until its back legs settled precisely on the spot where I'd placed the grain of rice. 6 inches from the table, exactly where it had been when we first walked into this house. The movement stopped. The room fell silent except for my ragged breathing. I didn't wait to see if anything else would happen. I fled upstairs, my bare feet silent on the carpeted steps, and slid back into bed beside Lena, my entire body shaking with cold sweat. She stirred, but didn't wake. I lay there until dawn, staring at the ceiling, the image of that chair moving on its own, burned into my mind. The next morning, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. Over coffee, my hand still trembling slightly, I told Lena everything. The sound, the measurement, the grain of rice, the deliberate movement at exactly 3:17 a.m. I expected skepticism. I expected her to suggest we both get more sleep. Instead, her face went pale. She set her mug down carefully, as if afraid it might shatter. "I thought it was a dream," she whispered. "Last night, I woke up just before 4. I came downstairs to get water, and I saw the chair was pulled out. I thought I'd forgotten to push it in after getting a glass. I pushed it back in and went to bed." She looked at me, her eyes wide. "But I didn't forget, did I? I pushed it in last night. I'm sure of it." We spent that day researching the house. The county records office was closed, but the local historical society had digitized archives online. We found the property records easily enough. Built in 1898, owned by the same family until 1972, then passed through several hands before being purchased by a couple named David and Sarah Mitchell in 2005. They'd lived here with their daughter Emily until the record stopped in 2019. No sale, no transfer, just silence. A search of local news archives from October 2019 yielded a single brief article buried on page 7 of the town paper. "Local family missing after weekend storm. David Mitchell, 42, a carpenter. Sarah Mitchell, 39, a librarian, and their daughter, Emily, 8, had been reported missing by Sarah's sister after failing to answer calls for 2 days following a severe thunderstorm that had knocked out power across the county. Their car was found parked in the driveway. The house showed no signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play. No bodies were ever recovered. The case went cold within months. The house stood empty for nearly 2 years before being quietly transferred to a holding company and then listed for rent, first to short-term tenants, then finally to us. We sat in silence after reading the article, the weight of the information settling over us like dust. A family, a little girl, vanished without a trace. And now, every night at 3:17 a.m., the exact time the coroner had estimated they were last seen alive based on a neighbor's testimony about seeing lights in the house, the empty chair pulled itself away from the table. "Why that chair?" Lena asked quietly that evening as we sat on the couch, both of us avoiding looking toward the dining room. "Why not all of them? Why just the one at the head?" I didn't have an answer, but that night I decided to watch again. This time I brought Lena with me. We sat on the bottom step of the staircase at 3:15 a.m., wrapped in a blanket despite the mild temperature, holding hands tightly. At 3:17 exactly, we both watched as the chair began its slow, deliberate retreat from the table. 6 inches, no more, no less. It stopped. The room remained otherwise undisturbed. No cold spots, no whispers, no apparitions. Just the chair, pulled back as if waiting for someone to sit. The next day, we pushed it back in. That night, it pulled itself out again, and the night after that, and the night after that. A ritual, a summons. After a week of this, something shifted. Lena, ever the teacher, ever the nurturer, began leaving things on the seat of the chair before bed. First just a napkin, folded neatly, then a placemat. Then, one night, a full place setting. Plate, fork, knife, spoon, even a glass of water. "If something wants to sit there," she said with a bravery I admired but didn't share, "let it have a proper place." That night, at 3:17 a.m., the chair pulled itself out as usual, but when it stopped 6 inches from the table, the water in the glass trembled. Not much, just a faint vibration that sent tiny ripples across the surface. And the napkin on the plate shifted slightly as if brushed by an invisible hand. I nearly vomited from fear. Lena just nodded slowly, as if confirming a hypothesis. The following day, she went to the library, Sarah Mitchell's former workplace, and spent hours digging through archived local newspapers and yearbooks. She returned with photocopies and a strange light in her eyes. "Emily Mitchell," she said, spreading the papers on the oak table, the very table where the phenomenon occurred. She was in 3rd grade at Oakwood Elementary. Her teacher described her as quiet, but imaginative, loved drawing, especially pictures of her family at dinner. She showed me a photocopy of a school newsletter featuring children's artwork. There, in faded crayon, was a drawing titled "My Happy Family" by Emily Mitchell. A stick figure mom and dad sat at a table with a smaller stick figure between them. And at the head of the table, facing the window, sat a 4th figure, a grandmother labeled Nana, with silver crayon hair and a blue dress. The caption read, "Nana comes to dinner every night, even though she lives in heaven now. Mommy sets a place for her." Lena looked up at me, her face pale. Emily's maternal grandmother, Eleanor Vance, died in August 2019, just 2 months before they disappeared. Heart failure. She lived alone after her husband passed. The Mitchells apparently had dinner with her every Sunday night at this house. After she died, Emily insisted they keep setting a place for her. Sarah Mitchell mentioned it in an interview after they went missing, said it was just a child's way of processing grief. 3:17 a.m., the time the neighbor saw lights on, the time a family sat down to dinner, the time a little girl set a place for her grandmother who lived in heaven. That night, we didn't just set a place. Lena prepared an actual meal, simple but complete. Roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, the kind of Sunday dinner a grandmother might have enjoyed. We placed it carefully on the plate at the head of the table. We filled a glass with water. We even lit a single candle in the center of the table, something we'd never done before. At 3:17 a.m., we watched from the doorway. The chair pulled itself out. 6 inches. It stopped. And then slowly, the chicken on the plate began to disappear. Not vanish, actually diminish, as if invisible teeth were taking small, precise bites. The potatoes followed. The green beans, the water level in the glass dropped by exactly 2 inches. The candle flame flickered. not from a draft, but as if someone had exhaled gently beside it. Lena began to cry, not from fear, but from a profound, aching sorrow. "They're still here," she whispered. "All of them. They never left." The next day, we contacted the Historical Society again, this time asking specifically about Eleanor Vance. What we learned broke something open inside me. Eleanor hadn't just died of heart failure. She'd died alone in her apartment 3 towns over after falling in her kitchen. She'd lain there for nearly 36 hours before a concerned neighbor checked on her. The coroner noted she'd been conscious for much of that time. There were drag marks on the floor where she'd tried to pull herself toward the phone. She died terrified and alone. But Emily, in her child's understanding of death, believed her grandmother came to dinner every Sunday anyway. And on that final night, October 12th, 2019, the Mitchells had sat down to their weekly Sunday dinner. They'd set a place for Eleanor, and sometime during that meal, something had happened. The official report mentioned scorch marks near the basement door and a strange sulfurous smell noted by first responders. The family had vanished, but perhaps not entirely, perhaps part of them. The part that believed in setting a place for loved ones who'd passed had remained, trapped in the ritual, waiting for the dinner to be completed, waiting for the chair to be pulled out, waiting to be acknowledged. That night, we did something different. At 3:16 a.m., we sat down at the table ourselves. Lena at one side, me at the other. We left the head chair empty, pulled out 6 inches from the table. We didn't set a place. We didn't prepare food. We just sat there in the dark, waiting. At 3:17 a.m., the chair began to move, but this time it didn't stop at 6 inches. It kept sliding backward, 8 inches, 10 inches, a foot, until it stood completely free of the table, and then slowly it began to turn, not on its legs, but as if lifted and, rotated by careful hands, it turned 90 degrees, then another 90, until it faced not the table, but the bay window, until it faced outward, toward the world beyond the glass, and then it began to move forward again, not toward the table, toward the window, 6 inches, a foot, 2 feet. It stopped when its front legs touched the baseboard beneath the window. Silence. We sat there for an hour, barely breathing. At 4:30 a.m., as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, we saw it, a faint impression on the dusty floorboards between the chair's original position and its new one. Not a drag mark, a series of small, distinct footprints, child-sized, leading from the chair to the window, and beside them 2 sets of adult footprints, all of them facing outward, toward the glass, toward freedom. The chair never moved again after that night. We left it where it stood, facing the window. We never pushed it back to the table. We continued to live in the house, cautiously at first, then with growing peace. The air felt different, lighter. The groaning floorboard sounded less like protests and more like the comfortable settling of an old house at rest. 6 months later, we received a letter from the county coroner's office, a form letter sent to all addresses associated with cold cases undergoing review. The Mitchell case had been officially closed, not solved, but closed, presumed deceased due to unexplained circumstances. The letter read, "No bodies found, no answers given." That evening, Lena and I sat at the oak table, just the 2 of us, in the 4 chairs we now used regularly. The 5th chair, remained at the foot of the table. The sixth, the head chair, still faced the bay window exactly where it had stopped moving that final night. As dusk settled over the backyard, I glanced toward the window and saw them, not as apparitions or shadows, but as a quality of light, a warmth in the fading day, a man's silhouette, broad-shouldered, a woman's slender form beside him, and between them, small and bright, the unmistakable shape of a child holding their hands. They stood at the edge of the property where the garden would bloom come spring, looking not at the house, but at the horizon. And then, as the last light of day vanished, they were gone. The chair still sits by the window. We dust around it, but never move it. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I'll catch Lena looking at it with a soft expression I can't quite name. Not sadness, not fear, but something like gratitude. And I understand. Some hauntings aren't about terror or unfinished business in the violent sense. Some are just about being seen, about having your rituals honored, about a child's belief in love, transcending death, being powerful enough to anchor souls to a dinner table until someone finally understands the invitation. We never asked why they vanished that night in 2019. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but I like to think that on that final Sunday dinner, as a storm raged outside and something unnatural crept up from the basement, David and Sarah Mitchell made a choice. They could have run, they could have fought, but instead they sat with their daughter at the table. They held her hands. They finished their meal, and in doing so they bound themselves not to the horror that took them, but to the love that defined them, waiting for someone to pull out the chair, to set a place, to witness. Every night at 3:17 a.m., I still wake, not from fear, but from habit. I lie there listening to the house breathe around me, the soft creak of wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves, and sometimes, just before I drift back to sleep, I imagine I hear it one last time, not the scraping of a chair being pulled away, but the gentle sigh of one being pushed in. A ritual completed, a table finally empty, a family, at long last, permitted to leave the dinner table and walk toward the light. And that ends this story. A new one starts now. The house that remembers. I am writing this from a borrowed laptop in a library in Duluth, Minnesota. I don't have a phone anymore. I don't have a car. I walked here in the snow wearing boots that aren't mine. If you're reading this and you see a listing on Airbnb for a secluded historic manor in the Black Woods with a host named Mrs. Gable, do not book it. Do not even look at the photos. The photos are a lie, but not in the way you think. The photos show the house as it wants to be seen. They don't show what it keeps in the walls. My name is Sarah. I'm a freelance photographer, or I was. I specialize in architectural photography, abandoned places, ruins, the kind of decay porn that gets likes on Instagram. I was broke, my camera gear was pawned, and I needed a gig. When I got the email from a private client offering me $5,000 to document a family estate before it was demolished, I jumped at it. The client, a lawyer named Mr. Sterling, was vague. "The house has history," he said on the phone. His voice was tinny, like he was speaking from inside a metal box. "The family wants a record of it, every room, every corner, but you must do it at night. The lighting is specific." "At night?" I asked. "Yes, the house wakes up at night. The architecture changes with the shadows. It's an aesthetic choice." I agreed. I rented a car, bought back my camera, and drove north. The house was located at the end of a long, overgrown driveway that wound through a forest of dead birch trees. They looked like white bones sticking out of the earth. The house itself was a monstrosity. It was Victorian, but wrong. The angles were too sharp. The windows were too narrow, like squinting eyes. It was painted a color that might have been blue once, but had rotted into a bruised purple. Mr. Sterling wasn't there. He had left a key under the mat, a heavy iron key that felt cold enough to burn my skin. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. It wasn't mold or dust. It smelled like dried flowers and old perfume masking something underneath, something like raw meat left in the sun. The interior was pristine, dust-free. The furniture was draped in white sheets. The mirrors were covered with black cloth. I set up my gear in the foyer. It was 8 p.m. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the floorboards. I started shooting. Click, flash, whir. The first hour was normal. I moved from room to room, the library, the dining hall, the parlor. The house was beautiful in a grotesque way. The wallpaper was patterned with intricate vines that looked like arteries. The chandeliers were made of crystal drops that resembled tears. But as midnight approached, the house changed. I was in the kitchen. It was a large tiled room with a massive cast iron stove. I was setting up my tripod to capture the stove when I heard it. Clink. It sounded like silverware hitting a plate. I froze. Hello? Silence. I looked around. The kitchen was empty. The drawers were closed. Clink. Scrape. It came from the dining room, the room I had just left. I grabbed my tripod, wielding it like a club, and walked slowly to the dining room doorway. The room was dark. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom. The table, which had been empty 10 minutes ago, was set. There were 4 place settings: fine china, crystal goblets, silver cutlery arranged perfectly, and in the center of the table there was a roast, a steaming hot roast beef, oozing red juices onto a silver platter. My breath caught in my throat. I was alone. I had locked the door. I walked closer. The heat from the meat hit my face. It was real. I raised my camera. I had to document this. Click. The flash illuminated the room for a split second. In that split second, I saw them. Seated at the 4 chairs were figures. They were translucent, like smoke caught in glass. A man, a woman, and 2 children. They were dressed in clothes from the 1900s, but their faces were blurred, smudged, like someone had taken an eraser to a pencil drawing. Where their eyes and mouths should be, there was just smooth gray skin. The flash died. Darkness returned. I shined my flashlight at the chairs. Empty. The food was still there. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. Okay, I whispered. Prank. Someone is messing with me. I turned to run to the front door. It was gone. Where the front door had been, there was now a wall, a solid wall covered in the artery-patterned wallpaper. I touched it. It was cold and damp. It felt like skin. I ran to the windows. They were shuttered from the outside. I tried to lift the sash, painted shut. I smashed the glass with my tripod. Behind the glass there was no outside. There were bricks, a solid wall of bricks. I was sealed in. Then the whispering started. It came from the vents, from the floorboards, from the walls themselves. She sees us. She sees the dinner. Does she want a plate? She looks hungry. I ran up the stairs. Why? I don't know. Instinct. High ground. I barricaded myself in the master bedroom. It had a heavy oak door with a bolt lock. I slid the bolt home and pushed a dresser in front of it. I sat on the bed, shaking. I checked my photos on the camera's display screen. The photo of the dining room. In the picture, the chairs were empty, but the roast beef wasn't meat. It was a human head, a severed gray head on a platter, and it was screaming. I dropped the camera. It hit the floor and the lens shattered. I huddled in the corner. This isn't real. This isn't real. Knock, knock, knock. 3 polite taps on the bedroom door. "Room service," a voice called. It was a cheerful sing-song voice, a maid's voice. "Go away," I screamed. "But you didn't finish your dinner, miss," the voice said. "The master is offended." The doorknob rattled, slowly, then violently. The heavy dresser began to slide across the floor. Something with immense strength was pushing the door open. I looked around the room. There was a fireplace, a chimney. It was my only way out. I grabbed the fire poker and ran to the hearth. I looked up. It was dark, narrow, and smelled of soot. The bedroom door splintered. A hand reached through. It was gray, elongated, with fingers that had too many joints. I climbed into the fireplace. I pulled myself up onto the smoke shelf. I heard the door smash open. I heard heavy, wet footsteps enter the room. "Where is the little mouse?" a deep, guttural voice growled. "She went up the chimney, sir," the maid's voice giggled. "Smoke her out," the deep voice said. I heard the strike of a match, then the whoosh of flames. Heat surged up the chimney. Smoke billowed around me. I coughed, my eyes burning. I climbed. I clawed at the rough bricks, tearing my fingernails. The heat was scorching the soles of my boots. I climbed until I saw stars. I pulled myself out onto the roof. I collapsed on the cold slate tiles, gasping for air. The smoke poured out of the chimney next to me, thick and black. I looked down. It was a 30-foot drop to the ground. But the ground was moving. The lawn wasn't grass. It was a sea of hands. Thousands of gray, spectral hands reaching up from the earth, grasping at the air. "Jump," they whispered. "Join us." I looked around the roof. There was a trellis on the side of the house, covered in dead vines. I crawled to it. I swung my legs over the edge. As I climbed down, I looked into the windows on the second floor. In every window, a face was watching me. The smudged faces, the eraser people, they were pressing against the glass, their featureless heads tracking my movement. And behind them, in the hallway, stood a tall shadow. It wore a top hat. It held a silver platter. I reached the ground. The spectral hands grabbed at my boots, but they were weak, misty. I kicked through them. I ran to my car. I fumbled for my keys. They were gone. I must have dropped them inside. I looked at the car. The tires were slashed, all 4 of them, and on the hood, scratched into the paint, were words, "Stay for dessert." I didn't stop. I ran into the woods. I ran until my lungs burned. I ran until the sun came up. I found a road. A truck driver picked me up. He didn't ask questions about the soot or the blood or the fact that I was crying hysterically. He dropped me off here in Duluth. I went to the police. I told them everything. They looked up the address I gave them. "Ma'am," the officer said gently, "there is no house at that location. That's the old Blackwood fire zone. A manor burned down there in 1922. Killed the whole family. They say the father went mad and poisoned them at dinner before setting the place alight." I was there, I insisted. I have photos. I reached for my camera bag. It was empty. The camera was gone. I had dropped it in the bedroom, but I found something else in the bag, a silver fork. It was heavy, tarnished antique silver, and engraved on the handle was a name, Sterling, the lawyer, the client. He wasn't a lawyer, he was one of them. I left the station. I pawned the fork for cash. That's how I'm surviving. But here is why I am writing this. Here is why I am terrified. Yesterday, I bought a disposable camera to take photos for a new job listing I found. Landscape work, safe work. I developed the film at a 1-hour photo lab. The first 12 photos were just trees and lakes. But the last photo, I didn't take the last photo. It shows me sleeping. In the motel room I stayed in last night, I'm asleep in the bed. And standing over me, looking down at my face, are the 4 smudged figures, the family, and in the corner of the room, reflected in the mirror, is the tall shadow with the top hat. He is holding a silver platter, and on the platter there is a camera lens, my broken camera lens. They followed me. They are not bound to the house. The house is just where they eat, and they are still hungry. I am leaving this laptop here. I am leaving this town. I don't know where I'm going. Somewhere crowded, somewhere bright. But I know it won't matter, because just now, as I was typing this, the librarian walked by. She smiled at me, but for a split second, her face blurred. Her eyes and mouth disappeared, leaving only smooth gray skin. And she whispered, in a voice that sounded like silverware on a plate, "Dinner is served." And that's where this story ends. Let's move on to the next one. The old woman in the window has been dead for 30 years. I should have listened to the realtor, not the slick, too smooth one with the practiced smile who showed me the listing, but the ancient woman who ran the corner store 2 blocks down, the one whose eyes widened like saucers when I mentioned I'd just signed the lease on 47 Willow Creek Lane. She dropped the jar of pickles she was stocking, the shatter echoing in her tiny, cluttered shop. "That house?" she'd hissed, her voice barely a whisper, her gnarled hands trembling as she wiped vinegar off the floor with a rag that looked older than the building itself. "Child, you best turn right around. That house, it's got eyes. And the one in the window, she ain't blinking for nobody." Before I could ask what she meant, she'd shooed me out, muttering about bad bones and old debts, refusing to take my money for the soda I'd picked up. I'd laughed it off. Superstitious nonsense. Desperation for affordable rent in this city makes you dismiss a lot of red flags, especially when the apartment is miraculously perfect. A spacious, sun-drenched studio on the 3rd floor of a quiet, if slightly shabby brick building for half the market rate. The landlord, a nervous, bird-like man named Mr. Henderson, had practically thrust the keys into my hands, avoiding eye contact, mumbling about cleaning the place thoroughly and keeping the shades drawn at night. I didn't think much of it. Everyone has quirks. The apartment itself was lovely, high ceilings, original hardwood floors, a large window overlooking a secluded, overgrown courtyard. It felt like a sanctuary after months of noisy roommates and crumbling studio walls. I unpacked my meager belongings, hanging my few photos, setting up my laptop on the small desk. The only oddity was the window. The previous tenant must have left the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight. I pulled them back with a flourish, eager to let in the afternoon light, and that's when I saw her. Directly across the narrow courtyard, in the window of the identical building facing mine, stood an old woman. She was impossibly thin, draped in a faded floral housecoat that hung loosely on her frame. Her white hair was pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was a road map of deep wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp, alert, and fixed directly on me, unblinkingly. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just watched. I offered a hesitant neighborly wave. Nothing, not a flicker of recognition, just that steady, unnerving gaze. I shrugged it off. Eccentric neighbor, maybe hard of hearing. I turned back to unpacking, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It intensified. Every time I glanced towards the window, she was there, standing in the exact same spot, in the same pose, staring. At dusk, I drew my own curtains, seeking privacy for the night. The next morning, when I opened them, she was already there, waiting. This became the pattern. Dawn, noon, dusk. She was a fixture in that window, a silent sentinel. It was unsettling, but not overtly threatening, just persistent. The first real chill came 3 days in. I was making coffee, glancing idly across the courtyard. The old woman was gone. The window was empty. A wave of relief washed over me, quickly followed by a pang of irrational guilt. Had I been rude? Too dismissive? I peered closer. The apartment beyond the window seemed dark, neglected, dusty, unlived in. That afternoon, driven by a mix of curiosity and unease, I took a walk around the block. The building opposite mine, 49 Willow Creek Lane, looked abandoned. Boards covered some lower windows. The front door was chained shut with a heavy padlock thick with rust. Mail overflowed from a cracked box. No sign of life, no sign of the old woman. Confused, I went back to my apartment. As I unlocked my door, I glanced up at 49 Willow Creek. My blood turned to ice. She was back, standing in the window, staring straight at me. Her expression seemed reproachful. How? The building was sealed shut. I ran downstairs, pounding on the chained front door of 49. No answer. I peered through a grimy ground floor window. The interior was dark, filled with shrouded furniture and layers of dust. Definitely empty. I asked a passing mail carrier. He shook his head. That place. Been vacant since Mrs. Gable died, 30 years ago last November. Heart attack, they say. Found her right there in that front room by the window. He pointed. Never rented it out since. Owner's scared of it, I reckon. Mrs. Gable, dead for 30 years. I stumbled back to my apartment, my legs weak. It was impossible. A trick of the light? A shared hallucination? But the details were too sharp, too consistent. The floral housecoat, the severe bun, the unblinking, watchful eyes. That night, I drew my curtains tight and didn't open them for 2 days. I worked from home, ordered, groceries delivered, convinced myself I'd imagined it all, a stress-induced mirage. On the third night, the power went out. A city-wide blackout, the radio said. My phone flashlight was weak, casting long, dancing shadows. I needed air. I cracked my front door, stepping into the dimly lit hallway just as the emergency lights flickered on, and I looked up. Across the courtyard, 49 Willow Creek was pitch black. All windows dark, except one, the window of the front room. It glowed with a soft, steady yellow light, like a single lamp had been turned on, and in that pool of light, standing exactly as before, was Mrs. Gable. She wasn't looking at the courtyard. She was looking directly at my building, directly at my window. Her face was pale in the lamplight, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open, not in a scream, in an urgent, silent plea. The rational part of my brain shattered. This wasn't imagination. This was her. And she had something to say. The blackout ended, and an hour later, the light in her window vanished. She was gone. The next day, I went to the local library, digging through microfiche records. Eleanor Gable died November 12, 1993, age 78. Found alone in her apartment. No close family. The obituary was brief, but a small buried news snippet from a week later caught my eye. Police investigate impossible connection to disappearance of young woman Sarah Chen, last seen near Willow Creek Lane, October 31, 1993. Ms. Chen was reportedly seen arguing with an elderly resident described as matching Ms. Gable's description, hours before vanishing. No charges filed. Case remains open. Sarah Chen vanished. Near here, after arguing with Eleanor Gable. My stomach lurched. Was that why Mrs. Gable's ghost was trapped? Guilt? A secret? Or was she trying to tell someone to show where Sarah was? That night, I stood by my window, curtains wide open, staring across the courtyard. I held up a handwritten sign, crude but clear. What do you want? Mrs. Gable appeared almost instantly, as if summoned. She didn't look at the sign. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a profound, desperate urgency. She raised a thin, trembling hand and pointed, not at me, but down towards the ground floor of her building. Then she pointed emphatically at her own chest, over her heart. She mimed digging, shoveling earth. Her mouth moved, forming silent words. Dig, here, heart. My breath fogged on the cold window pane. She wasn't pointing to a grave outside. She was pointing to the floor of her apartment, the floor where she died, where Sarah Chen might have been hidden. She wanted me to find Sarah, to give her peace, to give herself peace. The weight of it pressed down on me. The decades of silence, the burden of a secret held by a ghost, the lost girl waiting in the dark earth beneath linoleum and floorboards. I couldn't go to the police. A ghost told me to dig up a vacant building. They'd laugh me out of the station. I had to do it myself. I waited until midnight. The city was quiet. I slipped out of my building, heart pounding, and approached 49 Willow Creek. The padlock on the front door was rusted, but the chain was old. I'd brought bolt cutters. The snick of the chain parting sounded like a gunshot in the silent street. The front door groaned open on stiff hinges, releasing a wave of stale, cold air that smelled of dust, mildew, and something else. Something sickly sweet, like old flowers left to rot. Inside, it was a time capsule. Faded floral wallpaper, a threadbare armchair, a small table with a teacup, the dregs long since evaporated, leaving a dark stain. And there, by the window, a straight-back chair, the place where she died. The floorboards near it looked different, slightly raised. Newer wood, poorly matched, covered by a thin, frayed rug. I dropped to my knees, pulling the rug aside. My fingers found the edge of a loose board. It lifted easily. Underneath wasn't dirt. It was a hollow space, and nestled in the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth that was brittle with age, was a small, leather-bound journal. As I pulled it out, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath plumed white. The single bare bulb in the hallway outside the apartment door flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows. And in the doorway, filling the frame, stood Mrs. Gable, not translucent, solid, real. She wasn't wearing her housecoat. She was in a simple, old-fashioned dress, her hair neatly combed. Her eyes weren't watchful anymore. They were filled with tears. She didn't speak. She just pointed at the journal in my hands, her expression a mixture of profound sorrow and desperate hope. I didn't open it there. I couldn't. I tucked it inside my jacket, the leather cold against my skin, and fled the apartment, rechaining the door as best I could. Back in my own place, under the bright, safe light of my desk lamp, I carefully unwrapped the oilcloth. The journal belonged to Sarah Chen. The entries were frantic, scared. She'd been Eleanor Gable's home health aide. She'd discovered Eleanor's secret, a hidden cache of stolen jewelry, heirlooms she'd taken from previous elderly tenants she'd cared for, tenants who had died under suspicious circumstances. Sarah had threatened to go to the police. The last entry, dated October 30th, 1993, was chilling. She knows I know. She's watching me all the time. Says if I tell, she'll say I stole it. She's got a place under the floor. She showed me. Said it's where troubles disappear. I'm so scared I have to get out tonight. Eleanor hadn't killed Sarah. She'd hidden her alive, buried her under the floor. The journal didn't say. But the implication was clear. Eleanor's guilt wasn't for murder, but for imprisonment, for letting fear and greed trap a young woman in the dark for 30 years. I knew what I had to do. I called the police first. Thing in the morning, anonymous, giving only the address and the words. Check under the floorboards near the window. You'll find Sarah Chen's journal, and maybe more. I hung up before they could trace the call. I watched from my window as police cars and a forensics van arrived at 49 Willow Creek. They broke down the door. Hours passed. Then a body bag was brought out. Not one, two, smaller, wrapped separately. Dental records, they'd confirmed Sarah Chen. The second body, older, female, Eleanor Gable. She hadn't died of a heart attack in her chair. She'd died down there in the dark with her secret. Had she gone down herself, consumed by guilt, or had something else claimed her in the end? The news reported the discovery. The stolen jewelry was found hidden in a wall cavity. Mrs. Gable was posthumously charged in Sarah's kidnapping and imprisonment. The case was closed. Justice of a sort. That night, I opened my curtains. The window across the courtyard was dark, empty. Mrs. Gable was gone. The oppressive feeling of being watched had vanished. The apartment felt lighter, quieter, in a peaceful way. I thought it was over. I could finally breathe. I was wrong. 3 nights later, I woke to a soft tap, tap, tap on my window. Not rain, delicate, insistent, like fingernails. I sat up, dread coiling in my stomach. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I turned toward the window. She was there, Sarah Chen, young, pale, her eyes wide with the same terror that filled her journal's final pages. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking down at the ground far below, her hands pressed against the glass as if trying to push through. Her mouth moved silently. Get me out. The floor under Eleanor's apartment wasn't the only grave, the courtyard soil itself. It held secrets. Eleanor had lied in her final ghostly plea. She'd pointed to her heart, to the floor, to distract. The real prison, the real grave was outside. And Sarah's spirit, freed from the suffocating dark under the floorboards, was now trapped above her own earthly remains, unable to move on, unable to find peace until her bones were found. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. Sarah's face pressed harder against the glass, her eyes now fixed on me, filled with a new desperate plea. "You found a journal. You found her. Now find me." I sank back onto my bed, the weight of the house's history crushing me. The old woman in the window had been dead for 30 years. But her crime had chained another soul to this place, and now that soul was looking to me, the witness, the finder of secrets. The tapping didn't stop. It echoed in the silent room, a metronome counting down the seconds until I faced the truth buried in the soil below my window. The courtyard wasn't just overgrown, it was a cemetery. And Sarah Chen was still waiting. The old woman's guilt was absolved, but the debt remained, and I was the only one who could pay it. I pulled my knees to my chest, watching Sarah's pale face in the glass, her silent tears fogging the pain. The digging hadn't ended. It had just begun, and the next grave was mine to find. The tapping softened, became a whisper against the glass. "Help me." I closed my eyes. The courtyard waited. The earth held its breath. And I knew I wouldn't sleep again until I turned its dark soil, searching for the bones of the girl who never came home. The old woman was gone, but her shadow stretched long, and it had fallen squarely on me. The window wasn't just a view anymore. It was a mirror reflecting a debt I couldn't refuse. Sarah's eyes held mine through the glass, a silent promise. "You see me? Now set me free." And I knew, with a cold certainty that seeped into my bones, that I would, even if it meant digging until my own hands bled in the haunted earth of Willow Creek Lane. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of the grave, waiting to be opened. I got out of bed. I had a shovel to find. And so, this story comes to an end. Let's start another. The shadow that follows me home always arrives a few seconds before I do it, started with the porch light. Not the light itself, that old yellow bug zapper bulb my landlord refused to replace, but the shadow it cast when I pulled into the driveway. I'd be turning the key in the ignition, my hand still on the gear shift, when I catch movement in my peripheral vision. A dark shape slipping past the living room window. Just a flicker. Gone before I could focus on it. The first time, I chalked it up to fatigue. I'd been working late shifts at the hospital for 3 weeks straight, my circadian rhythm shattered, my eyes playing tricks after 12 hours under fluorescent lights. The second time, I told myself it was a neighbor's cat darting through the yard, its silhouette magnified and distorted by the grimy window pane. The third time, I sat in the car for a full minute after parking, watching the dark windows of my rented bungalow, waiting to see if it would happen again. It did. I killed the engine at 11:47 p.m. Before my seatbelt even clicked loose, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near the front door and glided across the window, left to right, smooth and deliberate, unmistakably humanoid in shape. I froze, my fingers still curled around the key fob. The shadow vanished behind the curtain covering the window's edge. I counted to 30, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then I stepped out of the car, moved quickly up the cracked concrete walkway, and unlocked the door with hands that trembled only slightly. The house was empty, exactly as I'd left it that morning. The throw blanket was draped over the arm of the sofa where I'd tossed it. The coffee mug I'd forgotten to wash sat in the sink, a faint brown ring staining its interior. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. I checked every room, the bedroom with its unmade bed, the bathroom with its damp towel on the floor, the tiny closet under the stairs where I kept my winter coats, all empty, all silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the thermostat adjusting to my presence. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the front window. The porch light cast a jaundiced glow across the porch boards, illuminating the welcome mat my predecessor had left behind. A faded thing with the words, "Gather," worn nearly illegible. For an hour I watched. Nothing moved except moths battering themselves against the glass. At 1:03 a.m., exhaustion finally overtook vigilance. I locked the deadbolt, set the chain, and went to bed. The next night, I conducted an experiment. I parked my car 3 houses down the street, killed the engine, and approached my bungalow on foot, moving slowly, silently, hugging the shadows between streetlights. I stopped at the property line, the exact spot where my driveway met the sidewalk, and watched the house for 5 full minutes. Stillness, darkness. The porch light buzzed softly, casting its sickly halo across the porch. Then, at 11:52 p.m., the shadow appeared. It didn't emerge from inside the house. It didn't slip from behind furniture or rise from a corner. It simply coalesced. One moment, the window was empty, except for the reflection of the street lamp across the way. The next, a human-shaped darkness stood silhouetted against the curtain, its edges unnaturally sharp despite the diffusion of the fabric. It turned its head, not a quick jerk, but a slow, deliberate rotation, until it seemed to be looking directly at me, standing frozen at the edge of my property. Then it raised one arm and pointed toward the front door. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I stood there for a full minute after it vanished, my body locked in place by a terror so profound it felt like reverence. When I finally moved, it was with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield. I approached the house step by excruciating step, my keys clutched between my knuckles like a weapon. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and slammed it shut behind me, throwing both locks with frantic haste. The house was empty. Again. But something was different. On the floor directly beneath the window, where I'd seen the shadow, lying precisely centered on the worn rug, was a single object I had not left there that morning, a child's hair ribbon, pale blue satin, slightly frayed at the edges, tied in a perfect bow. I picked it up with trembling fingers. It was cold, not room temperature cold. The deep, marrow-chilling cold of something that had been buried underground for a long time. I spent the next day researching the house. The county records office was a dusty room in the basement of City Hall, smelling of old paper and lemon-scented cleaner. The clerk, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, pulled the property file without hesitation when I gave her the address. 1437 Maple, she said, running a finger down the ledger. Built in 1923. Owned by the Henderson family until 1978. She paused, her finger stopping on an entry from October 1978. There was an incident. My throat went dry. What kind of incident? She looked up, her expression carefully neutral. A child disappeared. 6-year-old girl named Clara Henderson vanished from her bedroom one night. They never found her, never found a suspect. Case went cold within months. She closed the file gently. The family moved out immediately after, couldn't bear to stay. House stood empty for 2 years before being sold. Did they ever find remains? I asked, my voice barely audible. She shook her head. No, but there were rumors. Unsubstantiated, of course. Some neighbors claimed they saw a man leaving the property late that night. A stranger, not from the neighborhood. Others said the father had gambling debts. The mother never recovered. Died of a broken heart, folks said. She offered a sad smile. Houses hold memories, you know. Sometimes the sad ones stick harder than the happy ones. I left the records office with Clara Henderson's name echoing in my skull. That evening, I dug deeper, searching the newspaper archives online, scrolling through microfiche images until my eyes burned. I found the article from October 17th, 1978. Local girl 6, missing from home. A grainy photograph showed a smiling child with dark braids and a gap-toothed grin, wearing a pale blue dress. The caption read, Clara Henderson, shown here at her 6th birthday party last month, was last seen wearing a blue dress and matching hair ribbons. I zoomed in on the photograph until the pixels blurred. Tied neatly around each braid was a pale blue satin ribbon, exactly like the one I'd found on my rug. That night, I didn't come home until 2 a.m. I sat in my car down the street again, watching the house through binoculars I'd borrowed from a co-worker. At 2:07 a.m., the shadow appeared at the window, not pointing this time, but standing perfectly still, its head tilted as if listening. After 30 seconds, it raised both hands and pressed them against the inside of the glass. The gesture was unmistakable, not a threat, a plea. I waited until 3 a.m. before approaching the house. This time, I didn't rush inside. I stood on the porch for a full minute, my hand on the doorknob, listening. The house was silent. I unlocked the door and stepped inside slowly, leaving the door open behind me. The ribbon was gone from the rug. In its place lay a small tarnished locket, silver, heart-shaped, its surface scratched and dull with age. I picked it up with a handkerchief from my pocket and pried it open with my thumbnail. Inside, protected by cloudy glass, was a tiny photograph of Clara Henderson, and tucked behind the photograph a folded slip of paper so brittle it crackled when I unfolded it. In a child's careful printing it read, "He comes through the walls. He wears my father's face, but it is not my father. Tell them I did not run away. Tell them I am still here." Asterisk ice. Water flooded my veins. I stumbled backward, dropping the locket as if burned. My eyes scanned the room, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, searching for what I now understood I should have been looking for all along. Not an intruder coming through doors or windows. Something that moved through solid matter. Something that wore familiar faces to gain trust. Something that had taken a 6-year-old girl from her bed and hidden her so completely that not even her bones had ever been found, and something that was now trying to communicate with me through shadows and artifacts. The next day, I contacted the Cold Case Division of the local police department. I spoke to a detective named Ruiz, a weary man in his 50s with kind eyes and a voice worn smooth by decades of delivering bad news. I told him everything, the shadow at the window, the ribbon, the locket, the note. I didn't mention the supernatural elements. I framed it as a possible break-in, a stalker leaving increasingly disturbing tokens. I showed him photographs of the items I'd found. He listened patiently, taking notes without interruption. When I finished, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Ms. Chen, I appreciate you coming forward, truly. But the Clara Henderson case, we've had dozens of tips over the years. Psychics claiming to channel her spirit, neighbors confessing on their deathbeds, treasure hunters digging up backyards based on dreams. Nothing ever panned out." He slid a file across the desk toward me. "We never stopped looking, but after 45 years, the trail's cold, literally and figuratively." I opened the file. Crime scene photographs from 1978. Clara's bedroom, neatly made bed, stuffed animals arranged on the pillow, a small desk with crayons and coloring books, and on the wall beside the bed, a faint water stain in the shape of a child's handprint. The caption read, "Unexplained moisture stain, noted by first responders. No source identified." "May I?" I asked, pointing to the photograph. Ruiz nodded. "Go ahead. It's all public record now." I studied the handprint stain. It wasn't random. The fingers were splayed wide, the palm pressed flat against the wall as if in panic, and beneath it, almost invisible unless you knew to look, were tiny scratches in the plaster, so faint they could have been accidental marks from moving furniture. But they weren't. They formed letters, 3 of them, H-E-L. I looked up at Ruiz. "Did anyone ever analyze these scratches?" He shrugged. "Forensics in '78 wasn't what it is today. They noted the stain, but dismissed it as condensation. The scratches, probably just wear and tear." But I knew better. Clara hadn't just vanished. She'd tried to leave a message, scratched into the wall from the other side. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my armchair facing the front window, a baseball bat resting across my knees, every light in the house burning bright. At 11:59 p.m., the shadow appeared, not at the window this time, but in the center of the living room. It didn't flicker or fade. It simply stood there, a perfect silhouette of a small girl in a dress, her hands hanging at her sides, and then she moved, not toward me, toward the wall between the living room and Clara's old bedroom, the wall that still bore the water stain shaped like a child's hand. The shadow pressed its palms against the plaster, and the wall began to weep, not metaphorically. Actual moisture seeped from the surface, tracing the outline of small hands pressed flat against the other side. The plaster darkened, bubbling slightly as if something behind it was breathing against the barrier. And then, faint but unmistakable, came a sound, not through the air, but vibrating directly through the floorboards beneath my feet. A child's voice, muffled as if heard through layers of earth and stone. "He is coming. Hide." I didn't think. I didn't question. I dropped the bat and ran, not out the front door, but toward the back of the house, into the tiny bathroom with its single window overlooking the alley. I locked the door behind me and stood pressed against the tiles, my breath coming in ragged gasps. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The house remained silent. Then I heard it, the soft, wet sound of something moving through solid matter. Not footsteps, something worse. The sound of flesh parting plaster, of bone sliding between molecules. It came from the living room first, then the hallway, then stopped directly outside the bathroom door. The doorknob began to turn, not rattling, not forcing, turning smoothly, deliberately, as if operated by an invisible hand. I backed into the corner, my eyes fixed on the door, my entire body rigid with terror. The knob turned fully. The latch clicked open, but the door didn't swing inward. Instead, the wood itself began to change. The grain darkened, swirling into patterns that resolved into a face, a man's face, middle-aged, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that belonged on a father's face. But the smile was wrong. Too wide, too many teeth, and the eyes held no warmth, only hunger. The face in the door spoke, its voice a wet whisper that seemed to come from inside my own skull. "Clara, is that you, sweetheart? Daddy's here. Come out. It's time to come home." Asterisk. I clapped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, refusing to look at the thing wearing a father's face. And in that darkness behind my eyelids, I saw it. Not with my eyes, but with something deeper. Clara Henderson, not as a ghost or a memory, but as she existed now. A consciousness trapped between worlds, her physical form dissolved into the very structure of the house, her essence woven into the plaster and wood and pipes, her final moments of terror preserved like an insect in amber. She hadn't died that night in 1978. Something had taken her. Not to kill her, but to consume her slowly, to feed on her fear over decades, to keep her conscious and suffering as a perpetual source of sustenance. And the thing wearing her father's face was the predator that had done it, an entity that could move through walls, that could mimic loved ones, that fed on the terror of the trapped. And it had found a new source of food, me. The face in the door began to distort, the smile stretching wider, the eyes sinking into black pits. "You see her, don't you?" it whispered. "You see my little girl. She's been so lonely. But you can keep her company. You can stay with her forever." I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. The thing was feeding on my fear already, drawing it out of me like smoke from a fire, growing stronger with every heartbeat of panic. And then a small, cool hand slipped into mine. I opened my eyes. Clara stood beside me, not as a shadow, not as a projection, but solid and real, her small fingers wrapped tightly around mine. She wore the blue dress from the photograph, her braids tied with fresh ribbons. She looked up at me, her eyes clear and calm, and shook her head slowly. "Don't be afraid," she mouthed. "Fear is what it eats. Give it boredom, give it nothing." She squeezed my hand once, then released it and turned toward the door, toward the thing wearing her father's face. She didn't look afraid. She looked resolved. "You don't own me anymore," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her small size. "You never did. I was always here, and I was always watching." The face in the door contorted in rage, the wood splintering as something tried to force its way through. But Clara stepped forward and placed her palm flat against the surface. Where her hand touched, the wood didn't burn or crackle, it simply unmade itself. The molecules separated, the structure dissolved, and a hole opened in the door, not a tear or a break, but a perfect circle through which I could see the hallway beyond. And standing in that hallway was not a monster, not a predator, but a man, a real man. Gaunt and hollow-eyed, wearing the tattered remains of 1970s clothing, his hands raised in surrender. "Clara," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought you ran away. I thought I'd failed you." It was her real father, not the thing that had taken her, not the predator wearing his face. The actual man who had spent 45 years drowning in grief, who had died years ago still searching for his daughter, whose spirit had lingered in this house, hoping against hope that she might still be found. Clara looked at him, her expression softening. "I know, Daddy," she said. "I always knew." She turned back to me, her eyes meeting mine one last time. "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered, "for listening, for not being afraid at the end." Then she took her father's hand, and together they walked through the wall, not vanishing, but stepping into a light that hadn't been there a moment before, a soft golden radiance that filled the hallway and then faded, leaving only an empty house and a door with a perfect circle cut through its center. The thing that had worn her father's face was gone, not destroyed, not banished, but starved, deprived of the fear it needed to sustain itself. Without terror to feed on, it had simply unraveled. I moved out the next day. I didn't pack carefully. I threw clothes into suitcases, left furniture behind, abandoned dishes in the sink. I couldn't bear to spend another night in that house, even though I knew it was safe now, even though the walls no longer held a trapped child's terror. But the shadow didn't leave with me. I discovered this 3 nights later in my new apartment, a sterile studio on the 4th floor of a modern complex with electronic locks and security cameras. I'd just stepped off the elevator, my arms full of grocery bags, when I saw it through the peephole. A small human-shaped darkness moving across my living room window. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I fumbled for my keys, my hand shaking so badly I dropped them twice before getting the door open. The apartment was empty, clean, uninhabited except for me. But on the floor directly beneath the window, centered perfectly on the industrial carpet, lay a single pale blue hair ribbon, fresh, untarnished, tied in a perfect bow. I didn't pick it up. I didn't run. I simply stood there, tears streaming down my face, understanding finally dawning. Clara hadn't been trapped in that house. She'd been trapped in the moment of her greatest terror, the moment she realized the man standing over her bed wasn't her father. And that moment had followed her, would always follow her, until someone witnessed it without fear, until someone saw her not as a victim, but as a survivor, until someone stayed when every instinct screamed to run. The shadow that follows me home always arrives a few seconds before I do, not because it's haunting me, but because it's waiting for me. Because after 45 years of solitude, a child who died alone finally has someone to come home to, someone who sees her, someone who isn't afraid. Some nights, when the apartment is quiet and the city lights paint patterns on the ceiling, I feel a small weight settle on the edge of my bed. I don't open my eyes. I just reach out my hand, and a small, cool hand slips into mine. We sit together in the darkness, not in fear, but in companionship, not as victim and witness, but as friends. The shadow still arrives before I do. But now, when I open the door, I'm not afraid to find what's waiting on the other side, because sometimes the things that follow us home aren't monsters. Sometimes they're just lost children who need someone to see them, to remember them, to hold their hand until the light finally comes. And when that light comes, and it will come, Clara promises, it won't be a predator wearing a father's face. It will be her real father waiting with open arms. And she won't be alone when she steps into it. She'll be holding my hand, because some bonds aren't broken by death. Some connections transcend walls and time and terror. Some friendships are forged in the space between heartbeats, in the silence after a scream, in the courage to stay when every instinct says to run. The shadow arrives before I do. But now, when I step through the door, I'm not entering a haunted house. I'm coming home to a friend. And in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the world holds its breath and the veil grows thin, I am not alone. I am keeping watch. I am bearing witness. I am holding the hand of a child who was lost for 45 years until she finally found someone willing to see her, not as a ghost, not as a tragedy, but as Clara. 6 years old, wearing blue ribbons in her hair. And finally, after all this time, not afraid anymore. The story ends here. Let's begin the next one. Something keeps knocking from inside the walls. At exactly 3:17 a.m. The house on Hemlock Street wasn't chosen. It was assigned. A corporate relocation package with non-negotiable terms. Live here or lose the job that was my only lifeline after the divorce. The Victorian was grand in the way decaying things are grand, imposing, with gingerbread trim bleached bone white by decades of sun, a wraparound porch that sagged like a tired spine, and windows that watched the street with the blank, dusty eyes of the long dead. The realtor, a woman whose smile never reached her tired eyes, called it a fixer-upper with character. She didn't mention the silence that wasn't peaceful, but watchful. She didn't mention the smell that lingered beneath the fresh paint and lemon oil, a faint, cloying sweetness like overripe peaches left in a closed cupboard, mixed with the damp chill of deep earth, and she certainly didn't mention the knocking. It started on the third night. I was deep in the fragile sleep of exhaustion, tangled in unfamiliar sheets in the master bedroom on the second floor. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 3:16 a.m. The house was utterly still, the kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums until you hear your own blood rushing. Then, at precisely 3:17 a.m., it began. Thump! Not loud, not startlingly so, just a single, solid thump, like a heavy sack of flour dropped onto a wooden floor. It came from inside the wall beside the bed. The old plaster vibrated faintly against my back where I lay. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. Rats? Old pipes settling? The house was ancient. Such things happened. I waited, straining my ears. Silence. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I exhaled, willing my muscles to relax. Just the house settling. Go back to sleep. The next night, same time, 3:17 a.m. Thump. Louder this time, closer, like it was moving through the wall cavity towards the head of the bed. My skin prickled. I lay rigid, eyes wide in the darkness, every nerve ending alight. The silence that followed was thicker, heavier, expectant. I didn't sleep again that night. By the fifth night, I was a wreck. Dark circles under my eyes, hands trembling from too much coffee and too little sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed at 3:15 a.m., staring at the wall, a baseball bat resting across my knees. 3:16. The air grew colder, a deep, bone-chilling cold that seeped through the plaster and into my bones. My breath fogged in the moonlight, slicing through the window. 317. Thump. Not just a thump. A bang. Violent, insistent, like a fist pounding on the inside of the wall right at head height. The plaster dust sifted down onto the bedspread, I jumped, gripping the bat, half rising. "Who's there?" My voice sounded thin, ridiculous in the suffocating quiet. No answer, just the echo of the bang fading into the house's bones. The cold receded slowly, leaving me shivering, sweat cooling on my skin. It wasn't rats, it wasn't pipes, it was calling. At the same time every night, a ritual, a summons. I started researching. The local historical society archives were dusty and smelled of mildew. The house was built in 1898 for Silas Crow, a reclusive watchmaker. His wife Eleanor died of consumption in 1905. They had one son, Thomas. Thomas vanished in 1923 at the age of 28. No body found. Presumed drowned in the river. The file contained a single faded photograph, a stern-faced man, a frail woman holding a small boy with dark, solemn eyes, and a note, handwritten on the margin in spidery ink. Young Crow was prone to night terrors, spent weeks locked in his room before he disappeared. Neighbors reported strange knocking sounds from the walls at odd hours. 3:17 a.m. wasn't odd. It was specific, obsessively specific. The knocking became my anchor to a waking nightmare. I stopped sleeping in the master bedroom. I dragged an air mattress to the sunroom on the first floor. 3:17 a.m. Thump. From the wall beside the daybed. I moved to the guest room down the hall. 3:17 a.m. Thump. From the shared wall with the master bedroom, I tried the basement, a damp concrete space filled with old trunks and the furnace's groan. 3:17 a.m. Thump. From the ceiling directly above me, so violent it shook dust from the rafters. It wasn't tied to a room, it was tied to me. And to the time, 3:17 a.m. The witching hour? No, something else. I checked the newspaper archives for the date Thomas Crow vanished, November 3rd, 1923. The time of his last sighting, 3:17 a.m. He'd been seen arguing with his father near the river dock. He never came home. The police report listed his personal effects found near the water. A pocket watch stopped at 3:17. The house wasn't haunted by a generic spirit. It was haunted by Thomas Crow's final, trapped moment. The knocking wasn't a ghost trying to get out. It was the sound of him trying to get back in. To the house, to the room where he lived, to the life he'd been torn from, and it was resonating through the walls, a desperate echo, seeking its source. The cold wasn't just cold anymore. It was the chill of the riverbank in November, the smell of overripe peaches, the scent of the orchard that used to border the property where Thomas was said to have played as a child. The house was replaying his memory, and I was the audience, the unwilling witness. I couldn't take it. I called the only person I thought might understand, the reclusive historian who'd helped me with the archives, Dr. Eris Thorne. His voice on the phone was dry, like dead leaves. "Hemlock Street? 3:17? He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "That's the Crow Boy's time. He's not trying to scare you. He's trying to remember. The house, it holds on to pain like a sponge, especially the moment of severing, his." He paused. "The knocking. It's him hitting the wall from the inside of his own memory, trapped in that second, over and over. He needs an anchor, something from then to tether him here. Otherwise, the echo just grows louder, more desperate, until it breaks something." "What something?" I whispered, my throat tight. "The wall," Thorne said grimly. "Or your mind. Find what he lost. Find the watch. It's the key. He died holding it. It's the only thing that bridges his time and yours. Bring it to the wall at 3:9. Let him feel it. It might quiet the echo." Finding the watch felt impossible, lost to the river for a century. But Thorne mentioned a detail from the police report. Thomas's father, Silas, had been a watchmaker. He'd made the pocket watch for his son's 18th birthday, unique, engraved. Silas, consumed by grief and guilt, rumors swirled he'd argued Thomas into leaving that night, had never thrown anything of his son's away. His workshop, in the small shed behind the house, had been sealed after his death in 1930. "Check the shed," Thorne urged. "If it's anywhere, it's there, behind a loose floorboard, in a false bottom drawer." Silas couldn't bear to look at it, but he couldn't bear to part with it either. The shed was a dilapidated wooden structure choked by ivy, its door rusted shut. I kicked it open, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside, dust motes danced in the single shaft of light from a grimy window. Shelves lined the walls, covered in tools, gears, springs, and the ghostly outlines of removed items. A workbench stood in the center, scarred and stained with oil. My fingers trembled as I pulled up loose floorboards, pried at the back of drawers, tapped walls for hollow spaces. Nothing. Despair clawed at me. Then I noticed the workbench itself. The wood was warped, but one section near the leg seemed newer, less stained. I pried at it with a screwdriver. It lifted. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth brittle with age, was a small leather pouch. Inside was the watch, heavy, silver, tarnished black in places. I opened it with numb fingers. The glass face was cracked, frozen forever at 3:17. The interior lid bore a single engraving: "To Thomas, time is love, Father." That night, I didn't flee. I faced it. At 3:15 a.m., I stood in the master bedroom, the cold already seeping from the walls, frosting my breath. The pocket watch was heavy in my palm, ice cold. I pressed it flat against the wall where the knocking always started, right at head height. The plaster was freezing. I closed my eyes, holding my breath, waiting. 3:17 a.m. Silence. No thump, no bang. Just the frantic pounding of my own heart. Had it worked? Had the watch? Then a new sound, not from inside the wall, from right beside me. A soft, wet, gurgling sigh, like water draining from a clogged sink. I snapped my eyes open. Standing inches away, partially translucent, shimmering like heat haze off pavement, was a young man, early 20s, dressed in clothes from another century. Trousers, a white shirt, suspenders. His hair was dark, plastered wetly to his forehead. Water dripped from his clothes, pooling on the floorboards at his feet. His eyes were wide, terrified, fixed on the wall where I held the watch. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me at the memory of his last moment, and he was shivering violently, his lips blue, his skin the color of river clay. He reached out a dripping hand towards the watch, his fingers passing through the metal, through my hand, holding it. A look of profound, heart-wrenching confusion crossed his face. He couldn't touch it. He couldn't grasp the anchor. He was trapped in the echo, unable to step into the present, unable to touch the proof of his own existence. The gurgling sigh became a choked sob. Tears, clear as river water, streamed down his pale cheeks. He looked at me then, his eyes locking onto mine, not with malice, with a desperate, drowning plea. "Help me." The cold intensified, biting deep. The smell of river mud and wet wool filled the air. The pocket watch vibrated in my hand, a frantic, terrified pulse. Thomas wasn't just knocking, he was drowning. Over and over, in the memory of that November morning, pulled under by the current of his own unresolved end, the watch was the shore, but he couldn't reach it. I did the only thing I could think of. I didn't just hold the watch against the wall. I pressed it into the plaster, hard. Ignoring the splinters, ignoring the cold that burned like fire, I poured every ounce of my focus, my will, my desperate desire to help into that point of contact. "Thomas," I whispered, my voice raw, "it's real. You're real. Take it. Hold on." The vibration in the watch surged. The young man's form flickered, grew momentarily more solid. His dripping hand pressed flat against the wall right over the watch. For a fraction of a second, his fingers seemed to touch the metal. A look of pure, radiant relief flooded his face. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first breath he had taken in a century. The gurgling sigh eased. Then the light from the window seemed to shift. Not the moonlight. A soft, golden, dawn-like light began to emanate from the wall itself, from the spot where the watch was pressed. It wasn't hot, it was warm, like sunlight on stone. Thomas stepped into the light, not through the wall, but into the glow. His form became less translucent, more solid, more peaceful. The water stopped dripping from his clothes. The terrible blue tinge left his lips. He looked at me one last time, not with fear, with gratitude. A small, sad smile touched his lips. He raised a hand, not in farewell, but in benediction. Then he turned and walked, not into the wall, but upwards, following the shaft of golden light that seemed to stretch towards the ceiling, towards the sky beyond. He dissolved into the light, like mist burning off a river at sunrise. The pocket watch in my hand grew warm. The frantic vibration stilled. The cold vanished, replaced by a deep, comforting warmth that seeped from the wall into my bones. The smell of river mud faded, replaced by the clean scent of rain-washed earth. The silence that fell wasn't the watchful, hungry silence of before. It was the deep, peaceful quiet of a burden lifted, of a debt paid. I sank to my knees, tears streaming down my face, the warm watch clasped tightly in my hand. Dawn painted the room in soft pinks and golds. The house felt different, lighter, freer. The walls no longer felt like prison bars, but like shelter. I still live in a house on Hemlock Street. The realtor was right. It has character, but it's no longer haunted by a trapped moment. It's inhabited by peace. I keep the pocket watch on the mantelpiece in the living room. It doesn't keep time. The hands are still frozen at 3:17, but sometimes, on quiet mornings, I swear I feel a faint, warm pulse coming from it. Not a knock, a heartbeat, steady, calm, finally at rest. And I know Thomas is no longer drowning in the dark. He found a shore, because someone finally held out a hand. Someone finally listened to the knocking from inside the walls. The house is quiet now, truly quiet. And for the first time in 100 years, the silence is a gift.